A man loses his wife, leaving his young daughter behind in the desolate wilderness of his own home. A stranger enters, uninvited, unwelcome, and begins to piece together the fragments of a broken family. But when the blizzard hits and the little girl shivers on the brink of death, the man realizes he has lost his wife once and nearly lost his daughter because of his own cowardice. If you are reading this story, please like and comment with the name of the city you are in, so I know how far my story has come. The morning Caleb Mercer rode back from burying his wife, he didn't say a word to anyone. Not to the pastor who offered his hand at the gate. Not to the neighbor woman who'd left a pot of stew on the porch step. Not even to the little girl standing in the doorway of the house, 3 years old and barefoot, who watched him dismount with enormous dark eyes and reach up her arms the way small children do when they need someone to pick them up. He walked past her. He didn't mean to, or maybe he did. He honestly couldn't have said later which one was true. He put the horse in the barn, forked some hay he didn't need to fork, and stayed out there until the light was entirely gone and the little girl had been put to bed by the neighbor woman, who left without a word and never came back. That was the beginning of the Silent Ranch. Emma Mercer grew up understanding certain things without being told them outright. She understood that the kitchen was cold in the mornings and that she was supposed to light the stove herself once she was old enough to reach it. She understood that her father would answer a direct question with a yes or no, but that follow-up questions made his jaw go tight and his eyes go somewhere far away. She understood that the kids in Harlow Creek thought she was strange, too quiet, too watchful, wearing dresses that didn't quite fit because her father bought them by guessing her size from across a general store without measuring. She was 7 when she stopped trying to fit in at school, 8 when she stopped trying at home. The ranch itself wasn't a bad place exactly. It was a working property 3 miles outside of Harlow Creek, in the dry flatlands where the grass turned blonde in summer and the wind came in long, unbroken waves off the open plain. Her father ran cattle, and he ran them competently. He was not a lazy man. He was not a cruel man in the ways that some men in that country were cruel. He didn't raise his hand, didn't drink himself into ugliness, didn't curse her or call her names. He simply wasn't there, even when he was standing in the same room. The house itself had begun to reflect this absence. Not collapsed, not ruined, just unattended. A cabinet door hung on one hinge. The curtains in the main room were the ones Margaret had chosen 6 years ago, faded now to a pale shadow of their original blue. The garden out back had been given up entirely. The wood floors were clean enough, but had a kind of dullness that came from being swept without ever being scrubbed. Emma did what she could. She washed her own clothes and hung them on the line, and collected eggs from the hens, and made herself biscuits for breakfast, badly, with too much salt, because no one had taught her properly, and she'd learned from watching and from failing over and over until they were passable but never quite right. Her father fed himself from whatever she left on the stove or from cold meat he cut in the barn because he often didn't come in for supper. She didn't take it personally anymore. It had stopped hurting in the way that sharp things hurt and had settled into something duller, a weight she carried around so constantly that she'd stopped noticing it was there. The woman arrived on a Tuesday in early spring, which Emma would remember later as the kind of day that can't decide what season it is. Warm enough in the sun, cold in the shade, the sky an uncertain color between gray and blue. Emma was behind the house when the wagon came down the road, so she heard it before she saw it. The creak of wheels, the particular sound of a horse that had been driven a long distance. She came around the corner of the house in time to see her father standing in the yard, talking to someone on the wagon seat. The woman driving the wagon was not young. She wasn't old either. She was somewhere in the middle of those things, with brown hair pulled back without much fuss, wearing a plain dark dress that had seen better days but was clean and properly mended. Her hands on the reins were capable looking. She had a face that Emma couldn't immediately read. Not warm, not cold, just watching and thinking. "You Caleb Mercer?" the woman said. "I am. My name's Clara Hale. I answered your notice in Bridgeton, the one asking for a housekeeper." Emma's father crossed his arms. "That notice went out 8 weeks ago. Figured nobody was coming. Had some things to settle first." She paused. "I'm here now." He looked her over in that way he had. Not impolite, but thorough, like he was assessing something he might need to rely on. Pay is 40 cents a week plus board, he said. Room's off the kitchen. It's small. I've lived in smaller. He unfolded his arms. You can put the wagon in the barn. Emma watched the woman drive the wagon past and didn't move. Clara Hale didn't acknowledge her at first, and Emma was used to that. Most adults looked past her the same way they'd look past a piece of fence post. But then the woman stopped the wagon right beside her and looked down, not with the excessive brightness some people put on when they spoke to children, but plainly, directly, like Emma was just another person standing in the yard. You live here? Clara said. Yes, ma'am. Then I suppose we'll be seeing a lot of each other. She clucked to the horse and drove on. Emma stood there a moment. Something about the exchange felt different, though she couldn't have said exactly how. The woman hadn't smiled too much or asked her what her name was, or said something falsely cheerful, like the women in town sometimes did when they saw Emma and felt guilty about ignoring her the rest of the time. She'd just spoken to her like a fact. Emma didn't quite know what to do with that. The first few days, Clara Hale did very little talking and a tremendous amount of looking. She walked through every room of the house once, slowly, with her hands at her sides and her expression unreadable. She looked at the cabinet door that hung on one hinge and didn't say anything. She looked at the curtains and didn't say anything. She opened the back door and looked at the ruin of the garden for a long time. Then she started. She began with the kitchen because, as she told Emma matter-of-factly on the second morning, a house runs on its kitchen and everything else follows. Emma had been eating her usual bad biscuits at the table when Clara came in, took one look at what was on Emma's plate, and sat down across from her without asking permission. You make those yourself? Emma nodded, braced for something. How long you been doing that? 2 years maybe, since I was 6. Clara picked up one of the biscuits, turned it over, took a small bite. She chewed for a moment. Emma watched her, waiting. Too much salt, Clara said finally. I know. And you're patting the dough instead of folding it. That's why they're flat. I didn't know that's what I was doing wrong. Most people don't until someone shows them. Clara set the biscuit down. I'll show you this afternoon if you want. Not a lesson, just easier to show than to explain. Emma was quiet for a moment. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. It was the simplest thing. It shouldn't have felt like anything. But Emma had to look down at her plate for a moment because her throat had done something unexpected. Clara's first week established a rhythm that none of them had consciously agreed to, but all of them fell into. She rose before Emma and had the stove going by the time Emma came down. She made coffee for Caleb without being asked and left it on the table, hot, exactly the way he liked it, which she'd figured out by watching him make it himself on the first morning and noting exactly how he measured. She cooked actual meals, not elaborate things, but real ones, with flavor and heat and enough food that there were leftovers, which Emma had never really experienced before because she'd always cooked exactly enough for herself and nothing more. Caleb ate in near silence, the way he always had. But Emma noticed that he ate more. He finished everything on his plate and sometimes went back for more. And once he set his fork down and said simply, "Good," before pushing his chair back and going outside. Clara accepted this without visible reaction. She was already clearing the table. Emma watched all of this carefully, the way she watched everything in her world, as something that might suddenly stop, something that might be taken away, so you'd better pay attention to every detail of it while it was here. Yeah, the cabinet door was fixed by the end of the first week. Clara had asked Caleb directly where he kept his tools, and he told her, and the next morning she'd taken down the door, refitted the hinge, and rehung it herself without asking for help. Caleb came in at noon and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at the cabinet. You do that? He said. Door was hanging wrong, Clara said, without looking up from the pot she was tending. Wasn't hard. He didn't say anything else. But Emma, sitting at the table with a piece of mending in her lap, watched her father's face do something it very rarely did. She watched him look slightly off balance, like a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that when someone else picks up one end of it, he doesn't quite know what to do with his freed hand. The curtains were more complicated, not practically. Practically, new curtains were simple enough. The complication was that the curtains in the main room had been Margaret's curtains. Emma knew this the way she knew everything about her mother, secondhand, from fragments from the things that had been left behind and quietly kept. The color was faded now, but had been a particular shade of deep blue that Emma had heard described once by her grandmother as her mother's favorite. Clara noticed Emma hovering near the doorway one afternoon when she'd taken down the curtains to wash them. "I'm not replacing them," Clara said, not looking up from the washboard. "Just cleaning them." Emma leaned against the doorframe. "They're not really blue anymore." "No, they've had some sun." "They used to be. My grandmother said my mother chose them herself." Clara stopped what she was doing. She looked at Emma straight on, which was a thing she did that Emma had begun to notice. Clara didn't look away from things that other people looked away from. "Then they should be clean," Clara said, "and hung back where they belong." Emma didn't say anything. "You got something of your mother's? Something you keep?" Emma hesitated. Then she went upstairs and came back down with a small oval portrait, the kind taken in a photographer's studio, a serious young woman with dark hair and eyes very much like Emma's own. Clara looked at it for a long moment. She didn't say anything maudlin. She didn't say she was sorry or that her mother was beautiful or any of the things people said. "She looks like you," Clara said finally. "Around the eyes." Emma took the portrait back and held it against her chest for a second. "I don't really know what she was like. Maybe you can find out from your father. He doesn't talk about her." Clara was quiet for a moment. Maybe not yet. It was Emma who broke first, which surprised neither of them in the way it might have. She was 9 years old, and she'd been holding things together her whole life with the particular stoicism of children who've had to. And everyone has a limit. She found hers on an afternoon in April when she came home from school with mud on her dress and dried tear streaks on her face and walked straight past the kitchen, straight past Clara, and went up the stairs. Clara let her go. She gave it 15 minutes. Then she went upstairs with a cup of hot tea she'd sweetened because she'd noticed Emma had a sweet tooth. Not something Emma had told her, just something Clara had observed and filed away without comment. She knocked on the door. "Go away. I brought you something." Silence. "I'll leave it outside the door then." She set the cup down on the floorboards, started back down the hall. "Clara." She stopped. Emma's voice muffled by the door. "They said my father is crazy. That he's not right in the head because he doesn't come to town meetings and he talks to himself and I don't have a mother and my dresses are always wrong." Clara turned around and came back. She sat down on the floor outside the door with her back against the wall. "Who said it?" "Dora Hewitt and her cousin." "How old are they?" 11, both of them." "And what did you say back?" A pause. "Nothing. I just walked away. Sometimes that's the smart thing." It didn't feel smart. Emma's voice was thin. It felt like running away. "Yeah," Clara said. "There's a difference between leaving and running. Takes time to learn which is which." She was quiet for a moment. "Your father's not crazy. I know that. He's a man who got hit by something very hard and never found his way back from it entirely. That's different from crazy. But I know that doesn't make it feel better what those girls said." A long pause. Then the door opened a crack. Emma was sitting on the floor on her side, just like Clara was on hers, teacup now in hand. "What hit him?" Emma said. Clara looked at her steadily. "Losing your mother. And I think losing the version of himself that he thought he was going to be. That happens sometimes. People have a picture in their mind of how things are going to go. And when the picture breaks, it takes some of them a very long time to make a new one." Emma stared at the tea in her cup. "Is he making a new one?" "I honestly don't know," Clara paused, "but I think he's trying." The thing Caleb Mercer did not understand, watching all of this from the edges of his own life, was that Clara Hale was not performing kindness. He had known perform kindness, the ladies from town who'd come around in the weeks after Margaret died, with their casseroles and their lowered voices and their subtle auditing of the state of his house and his daughter. They'd been kind because kindness was expected and because it allowed them to measure themselves favorably against his visible grief. He'd gotten good at recognizing that particular texture. Clara didn't have that texture. She wasn't looking to be thanked or noticed. She wasn't building anything for herself by doing good in his house. She was just doing it, fixing the cabinet, washing the curtains, sitting on the floor outside his daughter's door, because it was in front of her and it needed doing. This disturbed him more than he would have expected. He found himself, toward the end of the first month, watching her across the supper table. Not with any particular intention, just watching, the way you watch a fire when you're used to cold rooms. She was asking Emma about something she'd read in school. Emma was answering in that halting way she had when she was afraid of saying the wrong thing, and Clara was listening without interrupting. And when Emma got to the end of what she was saying, Clara said simply, "That's an interesting way to think about it. Not correct, not wrong. Just met." Emma's whole posture changed when Clara said that. Just slightly, just enough. Caleb looked down at his plate and was surprised to find he was angry. Not at Clara, at himself. At the years of suppers, when Emma had said something and he'd responded with the minimum necessary words because he'd been somewhere else entirely. At the number of times Emma had needed to be met, and he hadn't even realized she was waiting. He ate the rest of his meal without speaking, which was not unusual. But what was unusual was that this time the silence had a different quality to it, less empty, more uncomfortable. Like a room that's finally warm enough that you can feel exactly how cold you've been. Honked. He couldn't have said when he started timing his mornings around the coffee. It wasn't intentional, or he told himself it wasn't. It was simply that the coffee Clara made was better than the coffee he made, and it was on the table, and he found himself coming in slightly earlier than he needed to so that it was still hot. And once he was sitting there with a hot cup, he would sometimes still be sitting there when Clara came in to start breakfast, and she would start breakfast without asking him to leave, which he appreciated, because in this house, silence had always been the shape of his comfort. But sometimes, not every morning, not even most mornings, she would say something, not personal, not pressing, just something. "Your fence on the north pasture's got a bad post, third one from the cottonwood. I noticed when I walked out yesterday. I'll get to it. I'm not criticizing, just noticed." A few days later, "Emma asked me where your wife is buried." He went very still. "I told her I didn't know," Clara said, "and that she should ask you." He was quiet for a long time. "What did she say?" "She said she already knew you'd say she was in the ground. She wanted to know the story." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "There isn't much of a story." "There always is. People just decide sometimes that telling it hurts more than keeping it." He didn't answer. Clara didn't push. She went back to the stove, and he finished his coffee, and he put on his hat and went outside. But he went to the north pasture first and found the bad post exactly where she'd said it was. Well, May came, and with it a change in Emma that was small at first and then couldn't be ignored. She started laughing. Not at things that warranted laughter necessarily. At a hen that did something ridiculous, at a sentence that came out wrong and backward when she was telling a story. Little laughs, quickly suppressed, the way someone laughs who isn't used to being allowed to. But they were there. She also started arguing. "That's not how you fold it," she told Clara one afternoon, about something she'd learned from Clara herself 3 weeks earlier. "It's one of the ways to fold it," Clara said. "But you said," "I said, that's how I do it. I didn't say it was the only way." Emma scrunched up her face. "That's confusing." "Most things worth learning are, at first." Emma argued about this for another 5 minutes, and Clara let her argue, and eventually Emma did it Clara's way and then admitted it worked better, which she did with the particular bad grace of a child who doesn't yet know how to concede a point without feeling defeated. Clara accepted the concession without making anything of it. Later that evening, Caleb heard the two of them in the kitchen. Some kind of back and forth that involved Emma raising her voice in that new way she had, emphatic rather than afraid, and Clara's lower response. And then both of them briefly quiet, and then a sound that took him several seconds to identify because he hadn't heard it in this house in so long. His daughter laughing, really laughing, the kind that has no dignity in it. He was sitting on the porch. He put his hands on his knees and looked out at the darkening plain and breathed through his nose for a moment. He hadn't known how much was gone until it started coming back. He made a mistake at the end of that first month. It was a small mistake, the kind that only matters because of everything it reveals about the person making it. He'd ridden into Harlow Creek for supplies, and while he was at the general store, the man behind the counter, Headley, who'd been in that town for 30 years and had opinions about everything, had asked about the woman he'd seen driving Caleb's wagon into town last week. "That your new housekeeper?" Headley said. "She helps around the house, yes," Caleb said. Where's she from? Bridgeton. She answered the notice. Headley nodded, loading the order. What happened to the last one? There wasn't a last one. Right. Been just you and the girl out there. A pause, the particular pause of a man about to say something he's already decided he has the right to say. People were getting a little worried about Emma. You know how people talk. I know how people talk, Caleb said. He paid for his supplies and left without saying anything else. He drove home and unloaded the wagon and went in for supper. And Clara had made something with beans and salt pork that smelled like actual food, and Emma was at the table already, telling Clara something about a bird she'd seen that afternoon with strange markings. And what Caleb felt, sitting down across from two people who'd made this table into something it hadn't been in years, was not gratitude, exactly. Not yet. It was something more defensive than that. Something closer to shame that hadn't quite found its form yet, that had turned sideways and come out instead as a kind of distance, a reassertion of the original arrangements. Clara was the housekeeper. This was a business arrangement. He wasn't going to let himself need it. He ate quietly and went to bed early, and Clara cleared the table without a word, and Emma looked at the empty chair for a moment before going upstairs. Caleb lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the wind come in off the plain, thinking about the word Headley had used. Worried. People were getting worried about Emma. He'd known that, on some level. He'd known what they thought of him in town, the man who'd never come back from his grief, the man who'd forgotten he had a daughter. He'd chosen not to know it. He'd chosen the silence of the ranch over the uncomfortable awareness of what the silence was costing. He stared at the ceiling and he thought, this is what it costs. He'd known theoretically. Now he was starting to understand it in a way that lived in his body rather than just his mind. He didn't know what to do with that yet, but he stayed awake long enough to feel the full weight of it. That, at least, was something new. Clara found the photograph the next morning. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been reorganizing the shelf in the main room where things had accumulated without order, and it fell out from between two books, a small photograph in a leather frame, a formal portrait of a man and woman on what was clearly a wedding day. She recognized Caleb Mercer, younger, without the lines around his eyes, standing very straight in a suit that didn't quite fit the way new suits rarely do on men who aren't used to wearing them. His expression was the expression of a man trying hard to look serious and not entirely managing it because of what was underneath. The woman beside him was Margaret. Clara had seen the oval portrait Emma kept upstairs. This was different. This was Margaret alive before the oval portrait, with her hand through Caleb's arm and her chin up and her eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression that was somewhere between joyful and fiercely certain, like a woman who's made a decision she intends to keep. Clara stood with the photograph for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the shelf where it was visible, not prominently displayed, just there, where it could be seen, and went back to her work. When Caleb came in at noon, he stopped when he saw it. He didn't say anything. He stood with his hat in his hands and looked at it for a long moment, longer than he'd looked at anything in a while. And then he set his hat on the peg and sat down for lunch. Clara put food on the table. She poured water. She sat down. Neither of them said anything about the photograph, but Caleb's eyes moved to it once more before he started eating, and when they did, his expression was not the locked, compressed thing it usually was. It was something rawer, something that had been allowed briefly to surface. He picked up his fork. She had strong opinions about curtains, he said. His voice was different, careful in a way that wasn't the usual caution. Clara waited. Blue, he said. She said every room needed something blue, said it kept the sky inside. He didn't say anything else. He ate his lunch, got up, and went back outside. Clara stayed at the table for a moment after he left, looking at the curtains, faded blue, washed clean now, the afternoon light coming through them in a way that turned everything in the room a little warmer, kept the sky inside. She got up and started clearing the dishes. Outside, through the window, she could see Emma running in the yard with the dog, her hair flying loose, laughing at something the dog had done, her arms open wide against the wide-open sky. The ranch was still far from whole. The people in it were still far from repaired, but something had begun, quietly and without announcement, in the way that most things worth anything begin. The curtains stayed blue. That was the small thing Caleb held on to in the days that followed his lunch with the photograph. The fact that he'd said something, out loud to another person, about Margaret, and the world had not cracked open. He hadn't expected that. He'd spent 6 years operating on the assumption that speaking her name, or anything adjacent to her name, would cost him something he couldn't afford to lose, some last remaining wall between himself and the full weight of what had happened. But he'd said it. She had strong opinions about curtains. And Clara had just listened, and he'd gone back to work, and the afternoon had continued in its ordinary way, and he was still standing. He didn't say anything else about Margaret for another 2 weeks, but something had shifted slightly in the architecture of his silence. Not gone, not opened up, just moved a fraction. The way a door that has been stuck for years sometimes needs only one firm push before it begins to be possible again. Clara noticed. She didn't say she noticed, which was the thing about her that he'd begun to rely on without meaning to. June arrived with heat that came in waves off the flatland and made everything beyond the fence line shimmer and blur at the edges. The cattle moved slower. The dog found shade and stayed in it. Even the wind, when it came, felt thick. Emma's school let out for the summer, which meant she was at the ranch full days, and this changed the house in ways that were not always comfortable and not always easy, and were mostly better than what had come before. She was 9 years old, and she had, somewhere in the previous 2 months, found a voice she'd apparently been sitting on for years. She had opinions about things. She had a restless, angular kind of energy that had no proper outlet yet, and so expressed itself in questions. Long chains of questions that connected to each other in ways that weren't always logical, but were always genuine. "Why does the top of the sky look darker than near the ground?" she asked Clara one morning. "Because the light's traveling through less air up high. But there's more sky up there." "More sky doesn't mean more air. Air sticks to the earth." Emma chewed on this. "Why?" "Gravity holds it." "Like it holds us?" "More or less." "So the sky is like the air is standing on the ground like we are?" Clara paused what she was doing. That's actually a pretty good way to think about it. Emma looked satisfied in the private way she had, which was not a big expression, just a slight settling of the shoulders. "I should tell my teacher that." "You could." "She'd probably say I was being a show-off." "Are you?" Emma thought about it seriously the way she did. "Maybe a little." "Then maybe say it in a way that sounds more like a question than an answer." Emma considered this. That feels like tricking her. "It's called being tactful. There's a difference." "I don't think there is." They went back and forth on this for another 10 minutes, while Clara made bread and Emma sat on the counter, which she'd started doing because no one had specifically told her she couldn't. And Clara had never told her to get down, so it had become a fixture. Emma on the counter, legs swinging, arguing philosophy with the woman making bread. Caleb heard them from the yard and didn't come inside. He stood near the open window for a moment with a bucket in his hand, just listening, and then he walked on to the barn. The sewing happened by accident. Clara had no particular plan to teach Emma to sew. Emma had no particular desire to learn. But one afternoon, Emma came home from walking the fence line, a habit she'd picked up, checking the post the way she'd seen her father do, with a long tear in the side of her dress where she'd caught it on the wire, and she held it up and looked at it with the resigned expression of someone who'd learned not to expect things to be fixed. "I can mend that," Clara said. "I know how to mend," Emma said. "I just do it badly." "Show me." Emma found the needle and thread bit by bit. She knew where they were because she'd needed them before and had found them herself. And she sat down and began sewing with the focused intensity of someone who knows they're doing something wrong but isn't sure exactly where the wrong is. Clara watched for a moment without speaking. "You're pulling it too tight," she said finally. "If I don't pull it, it comes loose." "Show me how loose." Emma did a few stitches with less tension. They were loose. "Now in between," Clara said. Emma tried. It was uneven. She made a sound of frustrated disgust. "It looks awful." "It looks like someone learning," Clara said. "That's the same thing." Not for very long. Clara reached over and turned the hem so Emma could see the underside. "Look at your own work from the inside. That's where you see what's actually happening." Emma looked. She was quiet for a moment, turning the fabric. "Oh," she said. "I see it now." "What do you see?" "The thread's bunching because I'm not starting the stitch in the right place." "That's it." Emma stared at the fabric. How did you know that just from watching? I made the same mistake for about 2 years, Clara said. Took me a long time to find someone who'd show me the inside. Emma looked up. Who showed you? Clara was quiet for a half-second. The kind of pause Emma had learned to pay attention to, the ones that meant something was back there, behind the answer. A woman I worked for a long time ago, Clara said. She was impatient about most things, but not sewing. Were you her housekeeper? Something like that. Emma seemed to sense the boundary and didn't push past it. Instead, she turned back to her mending and tried again, this time from a different angle, and the stitch was better. Not good, not even close to good, but better, which was different, which was what mattered. Clara watched her work. She didn't offer more guidance because Emma hadn't asked for it, and one of the things Clara had figured out about Emma Mercer in the 2 months since she'd arrived was that Emma did not want to be fixed. She wanted to be shown something once and then left to do it herself, with the understanding that if she needed more, she'd ask. She was a child who'd been too long without anyone to ask, and so she'd learned to ask sparingly, as if each ask was a limited resource she couldn't afford to waste. Which meant, Clara knew, that when Emma did ask for something, it mattered more than it would have with another child. It was July when Emma asked the thing she'd been building toward for months. They were weeding the kitchen garden. Clara had reclaimed a strip of ground behind the house in May and started a modest plot, mostly practical things. Some herbs, a few rows of beans, one small indulgent patch of marigolds because she liked the color, and because she'd decided the garden earned one thing that wasn't useful. Emma had appointed herself assistant gardener without being asked, which mostly meant she pulled weeds and asked questions and occasionally did something wrong that Clara corrected without drama. The day was overcast, which made the heat bearable. The marigolds were doing well. Emma was on her knees in the dirt, working at a stubborn root, and she said, without preamble, the way she sometimes came at things sideways because she'd been holding them for a while. Do you think my father will ever be like a regular father? Clara kept weeding. What's a regular father? One who, talks to you. Not just answers questions, but actually talks. He talks more than he used to. A little. Emma sat back on her heels. Some mornings he stays for almost the whole coffee. That's true. But then he leaves again, and he's gone all day, and at supper he's mostly quiet. She paused. I don't need him to be. I'm not asking for everything. I just want to know if it gets better or if this is how it is. Clara set down her trowel and looked at Emma directly. This was a serious question, and it deserved a serious answer, and Emma was old enough and had been through enough that she didn't deserve a softened one. I think it gets better, Clara said. I can't promise you by how much, but I've watched him, and I've seen him watching you, and what I think is, he knows he missed things, and that knowing is doing something to him. Whether he lets it move him or just lets it sit there and hurt him, that's something only he can decide. Emma was quiet, pulling a stem of grass out of the dirt. What if he decides wrong? Then he'll probably decide wrong for a while and then slowly start to figure it out. Clara paused. People almost never fix things in one go. They fix a little piece and then they walk away and then they come back and fix another piece. It's slow and it's not very satisfying to watch from the outside. I've been watching from the outside my whole life, Emma said. There was no self-pity in it, just the flat statement of a fact. I know, Clara said. That shouldn't have been the case. That part was wrong. Emma looked at her. You're not supposed to say my father was wrong. Why not? Because, I don't know. Adults usually don't say that. Adults say a lot of things that aren't true to avoid discomfort, Clara said. Your father got lost. He did things, or didn't do things, that he shouldn't have. Both of those are true at the same time, and neither one is the whole story. Emma turned this over for a while. The garden was quiet except for the distant sound of the cattle, and further away the faint sound of Caleb working, some repeated metallic rhythm from the direction of the barn, a hammer on something. Clara, Emma said. Are you going to stay? Clara kept her eyes on the marigolds. I plan to. But plans change. Sometimes. The other housekeeper, the one in town, the one who worked for the Hendersons, She left after 3 months because Mr. Henderson was difficult. Emma said this carefully. I'm not saying my father's difficult. I'm just saying people leave. They do, Clara said. So I'm asking. Clara stopped what she was doing. She looked at Emma, this 9-year-old girl with her knees muddy and her dark eyes steady and too old and her whole careful self waiting. I'm not planning on leaving, Clara said, but I won't make you a promise I can't guarantee because you're smart enough to know what that's worth. What I will tell you is that when I came here, I came because I needed a place and you needed someone in the house. And now, it's more than that. For me, this is more than just a position. She paused. Does that answer it? Emma seemed to measure this. She nodded once and went back to her weeding. The marigolds moved slightly in a brief, warm wind. Caleb Mercer was not an unobservant man. The problem was never what he saw. The problem was what he did with it once he'd seen it. He saw the garden come back to life. He saw Emma in it on her knees in the dirt, more animated than he'd seen her in years, arguing the merits of planting depth with someone who answered her arguments seriously. He saw the cabinet door that worked. He saw the curtains Margaret had chosen, clean now, moved by the afternoon air, the way they'd moved 6 years ago when Margaret was still there to see them. He saw his daughter sitting on the kitchen counter with her legs swinging, talking, which she'd never done in this kitchen, not in his memory. He saw all of it, and what it did to him was not simple. It was not just gratitude or relief. It was also something uncomfortable that he couldn't quite name, something that felt like standing in a room that has been altered while you were gone, and realizing that the alteration is better than what was there before, and that this somehow makes the absence worse, not better, because now you can see clearly what you allowed to be missing. He'd thought, for 6 years he'd held the idea, never fully formed, never examined, that the house had been fine, not good, but manageable, that Emma was managing, that he was managing. The word managing had done a lot of work in his interior life. Clara's presence had made it impossible to maintain the word managing. He came to this clarity in small, inconvenient increments. The afternoon he came inside and found Emma reading out loud to Clara while Clara mended something. Just reading, nothing special, a story from a school reader, Emma's voice careful and deliberate on the words, and Clara listening with the particular quality of attention that made being listened to feel like being taken seriously. He'd stood in the doorway for a moment too long and felt something cold and accurate move through him. Emma had never read to him. He'd never asked her to. He hadn't thought to ask. He'd gone back outside and stood by the water trough for a while with his hand on the side of it, and looked at the flat horizon and thought about all the years, which was a thing he usually tried very hard not to do. Clara knocked on the barn door one evening in early July, which she had never done before. He looked up from the harness he was mending. She was standing in the doorway with the early evening light behind her, and he couldn't read her expression at first. "Emma's asleep," she said. "I wanted to talk to you while she wasn't in the house." He set down the harness. "All right." Clara came in and stood not far from the door, which he noticed. She didn't come all the way in. She stayed near the exit, which was either habit or deliberate, and he wasn't sure which. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to be honest with me, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable." He waited. "Do you want things to be different?" she said. "With Emma. Do you actually want it, or is it something you feel you should want?" He was quiet for a moment. The horse moved in the stall behind him. "Why are you asking?" "Because there's a difference," Clara said. "And if it's the second thing, that's okay. It can become the first thing over time, but it matters which one it is right now, because Emma's starting to expect things. And she's been let down enough times that if she starts to expect and then gets nothing, it'll be worse than if she'd never started expecting at all." Caleb looked at the harness in his hands. He turned it over. He was not a man who talked easily about interior things. He'd spent his whole adult life in a culture that treated interior things as best left untouched, and he'd been shaped by that in ways he'd never really questioned. "It's both," he said finally. "At the same time. I know I should want it, and also I do want it, and I don't always know how to tell them apart." Clara nodded. "That's honest. It doesn't help her much." "No, not directly, but it's a starting place." She paused. "She asked me if you'd ever be like a regular father." He felt that land somewhere specific. He didn't look up. What did you tell her? I told her I thought it got better, that it was slow, that you were figuring something out. You didn't know that for certain. No. So you... I told her what I believed, said. Not what I knew. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Is it wrong? What I said? He finally looked up. No, it's not wrong. But then I'd ask you to make it right. Start small. Ask her what she read today. Tell her one thing about the ranch she might not know. Just be in the same room and present in it. Not every day. Just more than you have been. It was the plainest set of instructions anyone had given him in years, and there was nothing in it that was unreasonable, and he was aware, acutely, that it should have been obvious, that he should not have needed someone else to come into his house and tell him how to be present with his own daughter. I know, he said. He said it quietly, which was the only way he knew to say things that cost him. Clara seemed to accept this. She moved toward the door. She was nearly out when he said, Why did you come out here to say all this? She stopped, turned slightly. You could have said it at supper, he said, or in the morning. I could have, she said, but you're easier to talk to out here. You're less on guard. She paused. And I didn't want Emma to see me say it, in case you said something that hurt and I had to push back on you. He looked at her. Did you think I would? I thought you might, without meaning to. She held his gaze for a moment. You don't want to be the villain of this story, Mr. Mercer. I know that, but sometimes wanting not to be the villain isn't enough. Sometimes you have to go out of your way to not be. She left. He sat with that for a long time in the quiet of the barn. He tried the next morning. It was awkward, and he knew it was awkward, and Emma probably knew it was awkward, but she was kind enough or careful enough not to show it. He asked her what she'd been reading. She told him. A story about explorers going west, men mapping a country that didn't need to be mapped, she said, frowning a little, because the people who were already there already knew it. He looked at her. That's a complicated thought. Is it wrong? No, it's not wrong at all. He paused. I've been thinking something like that for a while about this country, about how we talk about it. Emma looked at him with the expression he'd started to recognize, her genuine interest, the one that didn't perform itself the way polite interest does. What do you think? She said. He told her. Not everything. He wasn't capable of everything yet, but some. A real thought, his own, not managed or abbreviated. He told her what he'd observed over years of working this land, the way the soil changed from one pasture to the next, the way the creek ran different in wet years versus dry, the way the plains had their own kind of knowledge in them that you could only get by staying still long enough to learn it. Emma listened. She asked questions. Some of them he could answer, and some of them he couldn't, and he said so, which surprised her, and she said, I thought adults always had answers. And he said, the ones who think they do are usually the least useful. And she laughed, not the big, undignified laugh she had with Clara, but a real one, a small one, directed at him. He carried that laugh around for the rest of the day in a way he didn't examine too carefully, but didn't set down either. Clara saw all of it from the edges, the way she saw most things, without making it known that she was watching. She saw Caleb and Emma at the fence one Saturday afternoon, Emma pointing at something, Caleb bending to see what she was pointing at. The two of them in a posture that looked nothing like estrangement and everything like the beginning of something else. She saw Emma look up at her father's face while he was talking and not quickly look away, the way she always had before. Instead holding the look, waiting for the sentence to finish, present. She saw Caleb, at supper, pass the dish to Emma before serving himself, which was small and probably habit, but was different from how he'd done it before. She saw him once, put his hand briefly on the top of Emma's head as he passed behind her chair. The kind of gesture that comes from somewhere that isn't thinking, and Emma had gone very still under his hand, not flinching but absorbing, the way you absorb warmth from a fire when you've been cold for a long time and the warmth is still slightly unfamiliar. Clara was glad, and she was also complicated about being glad, because she knew that the improved version of Caleb Mercer and his daughter was not her doing in any simple sense. What she'd done was stay and not make a production of it. She'd cleared a space and fixed what was broken and cooked real food and kept the house and been present. The rest of it, the actual repair of the thing between father and daughter, that was theirs to do. She'd just made it possible. The complication was that she'd started to care about the outcome in a way that went further than her original position warranted. She'd come here for a wage and a roof and some distance from a situation elsewhere she didn't think about more than she had to. She'd gotten those things. And then, without particularly intending to, she'd gotten other things besides. She'd gotten Emma, which is to say, she'd gotten used to the sound of Emma's voice and the particular quality of Emma's intelligence and the exact shade of Emma's laugh. She'd gotten the garden, which was hers now in all the ways that mattered, the labor and the watching and the marigolds, which were blooming a color so specific and vivid that she'd found herself once stopping in the middle of a task just to look at them. And she'd gotten something else, something she was more careful about, something she didn't look at directly, the way you don't look directly at the sun, because if she looked at it, she'd have to make decisions about it, and right now she was not ready to make decisions. She'd gotten Caleb Mercer in the peripheral way of someone who is always present and never central to what she was doing, always moving at the edge of her awareness, in the barn, on the range, at the table with his coffee, standing in the evening light with his hands in his pockets looking at the last color in the sky. She'd gotten his voice, low and unused and more particular than she'd expected. She'd gotten his occasional question, always direct, never ornamental. She'd gotten the morning he'd said she had strong opinions about curtains and the silence that came after and what the silence held. She didn't do anything with any of this. She kept her room off the kitchen and her work and her careful proportional distance, and she reminded herself when she needed reminding that she was the housekeeper. That was true, that had been the arrangement. And the fact that it felt like more than that, the fact that this house and these two people had gotten inside her defenses in a way she hadn't been prepared for, was something she could feel and still not act on, because acting on it wasn't her place and wasn't her right, and might break something that was just starting to hold. She was good at not acting on things. She'd had practice. The moment that cracked it a little came in August, a hot Tuesday afternoon when neither of them had been expecting anything in particular. Emma was in the garden. Caleb had ridden out to the East Range in the morning and wasn't expected back until late. Clara was in the kitchen making something for the week. Preserves, working through the last of the early summer fruit before it turned, when she heard the wagon come down the road. She didn't think anything of it at first, but the wagon stopped in the yard rather than passing, and when she went to the door she found a woman she didn't know, 50s, well-dressed for this country, with the kind of settled authority that comes from having been the most prominent woman in a small town long enough to stop questioning it. "You Clara Hale?" the woman said. She wasn't unfriendly exactly, but she had the particular quality of someone who decides where a conversation is going before it starts. "I am," Clara said. "Nora Fitch. My husband's the land agent here." She said it without preamble, like it should be recognized. "I've been meaning to come by. I knew Margaret Mercer." Clara stepped to the side. "Come in?" Nora Fitch came in and looked at the kitchen with the kind of comprehensive assessment that took in everything and revealed nothing. She sat at the table when Clara gestured to a chair. "I'll come to the point," Nora said. "I've heard you've made some changes out here." "Just keeping house," Clara said. "People in town have noticed that Emma is doing better, looks better, behaves better. Emma's a capable child. She was doing a lot of things on her own before I arrived." "Yes? Well," Nora set her hands on the table. "The town has also noticed that you've been here 3 months without any other arrangement announced. For the sake of that child's reputation, and Caleb's, there ought to be clarity about the nature of the position." Clara looked at her. "The nature of the position is housekeeper, which was in the notice." "The notice was 8 weeks old when you arrived," Nora said. "People talk. People talk regardless of what I do." "That may be true." Nora's voice was careful and pointed. "I'm not here to make accusations. I'm here because I was fond of Margaret, and I feel some responsibility for Emma's well-being, and I want to know that arrangements here are appropriate." Clara let the silence sit for a moment. She was aware of the heat coming off the stove and the sound of Emma in the garden and the preserves bubbling and the feeling she sometimes got in conversations like this one, a coolness in the chest, a deliberate settling of everything. "The arrangements here are appropriate," she said. "Emma is well-fed and well-clothed and has someone who looks after her. The house is in better condition than it was when I arrived. Caleb Mercer is a man of his word who treats me with respect." "I don't know what other clarity you're looking for." Nora looked at her steadily. You're not from here. No. Where are you from? Farther east. She didn't offer more. And before this position? Other positions. This kind of work is what I do. Nora seemed to be deciding something. Whatever she decided, it settled her into a different posture. Still formal, but less combative. I mean the child no harm, she said, quieter. I want you to know that. Whatever impression I've given, I did know Margaret. She was a good woman. She would have been troubled to see how this house was before. She doesn't have to be troubled anymore, Clara said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. Nora looked at her for a moment, and what passed between them was not warmth exactly, but something less hostile. A recognition, maybe, that they were each doing what they thought needed to be done. Nora stood. I'll find my own way out, she said, which was clearly untrue given the kitchen's single exit, but was a gesture of dignity, and Clara accepted it as such. She listened to the sound of the wagon leaving. Emma appeared in the doorway a minute later, fingers dirty from the garden. Who was that? Woman named Nora Fitch, the land agent's wife. Emma's expression was thoughtful, the way it got when she was putting something together. She was friends with my mother. She said that. What did she want? Clara turned back to the preserves. To check on things. Emma was quiet for a moment. Did she think you were doing something wrong? I think she came out here not being sure, and she left being less worried. Clara stirred the pot. People need to check on things sometimes. It's not always about accusation. Sometimes it's just not knowing. Emma leaned against the door frame. She could have asked. Yes, Clara said. She could have. Outside, the late summer afternoon was flat and gold, and the marigolds were blazing in the heat, and somewhere far out on the range, Caleb Mercer was riding back toward home, with the sky going orange above him, unaware that someone had come to inspect his life, and found it improved enough to leave alone. Clara kept stirring. The preserves were almost ready. Emma went back to the garden. The house held its warmth as the evening came on, a different kind of warmth than it had held 3 months ago. Not just heat from the stove, but the accumulated warmth of things repaired and people present, and days lived without the precise, particular loneliness that had been here when Clara arrived and had been, slowly, with no announcement and no ceremony, replaced by something that felt carefully and without certainty like the beginning of ordinary life. The first snow came in October, which was not unusual for that part of the country, and it came lightly, a dusting that covered the ground overnight and was mostly gone by noon the next day, leaving behind only the wet smell of it and the particular silence that follows any first snow, as if the land has been briefly reminded of what's coming and has gone quiet to think about it. Clara watched it melt from the kitchen window and did not say what she was thinking, which was that the sky had a color in it she didn't like. A yellow-gray at the edges, low and flat, the kind of color that doesn't mean anything specific in October, but can mean something very specific by November. She'd grown up far enough east that she hadn't learned the plains winters firsthand. But she'd been in this country long enough to learn from people who had, and what she'd learned was that the flatlands gave you almost no warning, and that the storms that came in off the open range could go from nothing to killing in under an hour. She mentioned it to Caleb that evening. Snow today, she said. Not the last of it. No, he said. Never is. We have enough laid in for a long stretch? He looked at her, not annoyed, just assessing where the question was coming from. I've been doing this 12 years, he said. I know that. She kept her voice level. I'm asking. He was quiet for a moment. We're short on lamp oil, and the woodpile could be higher. Then maybe this week, she said. He nodded. He'd already been thinking about it, she could tell. She'd learned to read the difference between him hearing a thing and him having already heard it from himself. He drove into Harlow Creek 2 days later and came back with oil and rope and an extra 50 pounds of flour and a look on his face like a man who does not enjoy being caught unprepared. The real snow held off through October. November arrived cold and clear, and the cold had a different quality to it than the cold of early fall. Drier, harder, with a bite that moved through wool and stayed there. Emma started wearing 2 pairs of stockings without being told. The cattle moved closer to the fence lines. The dog stayed near the porch. And then, on the 3rd Saturday of November, in the very early morning, Clara woke up and heard nothing. The nothing was the problem. She'd grown accustomed to the sounds of the ranch at night, the cattle in the dark, the creak of the house in the wind, the various small sounds that add up to a place being alive. What she heard now was an absence, a blanketed, pressed-down quiet that told her before she even looked out the window that the world outside had changed. She got up and pulled back the curtain. White. Total. Obliterating white. Still coming. Not in visible flakes, but in a density that moved sideways as much as down. Driven by a wind she could now hear. A low, sustained sound that was not dramatic but was worse for its lack of drama. The sound of something enormous and indifferent doing exactly what it intended to do. She dressed fast, added her heaviest shawl on top of her coat, and went out into the hall. Caleb's door was already open. Odd. He was in the kitchen when she got there, pulling on his second boot, his expression the closed, functional look of a man moving from assessment directly to action. "How long's it been coming?" she said. "Looks like most of the night." He stood up. "I need to get to the cattle." "The cattle can manage a few hours. Do we know the supply situation?" "I checked last night. Wood's high enough, oil's fine." "Food for 3 days at least?" "Clara." He stopped. Took a breath. Yes. "We're all right." She nodded. She didn't apologize for asking, and he didn't seem to expect her to. They had developed, over the past months, a particular shorthand, not warmth exactly, or not only warmth, but the more functional thing that grows between people who have shared the logistics of a life long enough to move through them efficiently. "Emma's still asleep," Claire said. "I'll get the stove going. I'll be back from the barn within the hour." "Take the rope," she said. "Tie it from the house to the barn door before you go 10 feet. He looked at her. She met his look. "I know," he said quietly. "I know to do that." He went. She heard him in the outer room, moving deliberately, and then the outer door opened and the sound of the wind came in hard, and then the door closed again, and it was quiet. She stood at the stove and got the fire going and thought about the color of the sky 2 weeks ago and was not glad to have been right. Emma came down at 7:30, still in her nightgown, hair tangled from sleep, and stood at the kitchen window for a full 10 seconds without saying anything. "That's a lot of snow," she said finally. "It is. Is it dangerous?" Clara thought about how to answer this. Emma was 9 and sharp, and did not need to be frightened, but she also didn't need to be lied to. And she'd been lied to by softened truths enough times that she had a particular sensitivity to them, a way of knowing when an adult was giving her a smoothed-over version of reality. "It could be, if we weren't careful," Claire said. "We're going to be careful." Emma absorbed this. She turned from the window. "What do we need to do?" "For now, get dressed in your warmest things. Then help me with breakfast, and we'll take stock of everything." Emma went upstairs without argument, which was itself a measure of how seriously she was taking things. Emma's natural mode was to argue the premise of any instruction before complying with it, and the fact that she'd gone straight upstairs without a single pushback meant she understood something in the quality of Clara's voice. She was back down in 8 minutes in 2 layers, her hair pulled back, her expression the focused, slightly too old look she got when she was deciding to be useful. "What should I do first?" she said. They worked through the morning together. Inventory, organization, the kind of deliberate preparing that is mostly psychological but is also practical, because a house that has been thought through is a different thing from a house that's been caught off guard. Clara counted the flour, the cornmeal, the salt pork, the beans, and the dried apples. Emma counted the lamp oil, found a forgotten candle cache behind the spare linens that she brought down with visible pride. Caleb came back from the barn at 9:30, ice in his beard, hands red from the cold. He stood in the kitchen doorway and let Clara hand him a cup of coffee without comment, and he drank half of it standing up before he said anything. "It's not letting up," he said. "Wind's coming from the northwest. If it holds that direction, we're in for at least 2 days of this, maybe 3. "The cattle?" Clara said. "In the near pasture. It's not ideal, but it's the best we can do. The storm came in faster than I expected." He paused. "There's nothing to be done for it now." Emma was at the table watching her father with the steady, careful attention she gave things that mattered. "Will they be all right?" Caleb looked at his daughter. There was something in the look, a new quality that had developed in recent months, a deliberate quality, as if he was choosing to be present rather than just happening to be in the same room. "Probably lose some," he said. "Not most of them. They're tougher than they look." Emma nodded, accepting this. The honesty was something she respected from him, Clara could see. The way Emma's whole body stayed open and attentive when Caleb spoke plainly to her, versus the slight closing that happened when adults decided to manage what she heard. The day passed in the particular suspended way of storm days. Work and waiting. Work and waiting. The light outside a flat whiteness that gave no indication of time. The wind a constant that moved between background and foreground depending on which moment you were in. Clara cooked. Caleb made rounds to the barn every 3 hours, tying himself to the rope he'd strung between the buildings, coming back each time more ice-covered, more expressionless in the way he got when he was managing discomfort without wanting anyone to make anything of it. Emma helped with the cooking, and then read, and then asked to help with something else. And eventually Clara gave her the task of keeping a written inventory. What they'd used, what remained, in a small notebook Emma took very seriously and annotated with the precise, slightly too large handwriting of a child working to make her letters look adult. By evening, nothing alarming had happened. The storm was severe, but the house was holding. The wood stove kept the temperature in the kitchen bearable, though the outer rooms were cold and they'd all tacitly agreed to stay in the kitchen and the 2 rooms adjacent. Emma fell asleep in the chair by the stove after supper, her notebook still open on her lap, and Caleb lifted her and carried her upstairs without waking her, which Clara watched from the kitchen doorway and said nothing about. He came back down and poured himself the last of the coffee and stood at the window looking out at the dark and the blowing white. "She's got her mother's way of falling asleep," he said. "Anywhere. Like a switch." "You miss her," Clara said. It wasn't a question, and she said it the way she said things that were simply true. Not carefully, not as a probe, just stated. "Every day," he said. "Less sharp than it was. But every day." Clara was quiet. "You ever lose someone?" he said. He glanced at her. "You don't have to say." "My husband," she said. 7 years ago." He turned from the window. She'd expected the question to go somewhere. Condolences, or more questions, or the uncomfortable shift of a conversation that's gotten too real. But he just looked at her steadily. "That's why you came west," he said. "Partly. And you got here, and this was the position available. It was the position that had been waiting long enough I figured whoever put out the notice was either serious or gone. Turns out you were serious." A pause. "I'm not sorry I came." He held her gaze for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved against the house in a long, leaning push and then released. "Neither am I," he said. He finished his coffee and went to bed. Clara stayed up another hour, checking the stove, listening to the storm, thinking about the way he'd said it, "Neither am I," without any of the careful hedging she might have expected from a man who'd spent years treating every statement about his interior life like it might detonate. She went to bed and slept lightly, the way she always did in unfamiliar weather. She heard Emma at 4 in the morning. Not crying, something different, a sound she couldn't identify. And it was this unidentifiability that brought her fully awake before she'd finished registering it. She was out of bed and in the hall in seconds. Emma's door was open. Clara could see her in the gray pre-dawn, still in her bed but moving wrong, the restless, repeated movement of someone in a fever's grip, her limbs working against the blankets without direction. Clara put her hand to Emma's forehead. The heat came off the child like an open oven. She said the word out loud before she could stop herself, a flat, short word that wasn't a curse exactly, but was the sound of a woman absorbing a bad fact and moving immediately past it into response. "Emma," she said. "Emma, wake up." Emma's eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused, and her lips were cracked at the corners. She said something that wasn't a real word. "I'm here," Clara said. "You're sick. I'm going to help you." She moved fast. She was in the hall knocking on Caleb's door before she'd made any conscious decision to do it. He opened it immediately, which meant he'd been awake, or nearly so. She had the brief, irrelevant thought that he slept like she did, lightly, with some part of himself always listening. One look at her face, and he was fully present. "Emma?" "Fever." "Hi. I need water heated and the extra blankets from the chest and everything you have for fever, whatever's in the medicine box." He was already moving. Machammed. The next 3 hours had the quality of a nightmare that insists on being completely real. Every detail hyper-present and demanding. No softening at the edges. Emma's temperature climbed. They could tell from the heat of her skin, from the way she drifted in and out of coherence, from the brief, vivid moments when she surfaced and looked at them with dark, burning eyes and said something recognizable before going back under. Clara worked through what she knew. Cool cloths to the forehead and neck and wrists, water whenever Emma could be made to swallow it, the elderberry syrup from the medicine box, which was old and possibly not much good but was something, broth heated and offered in small spoonfuls. Caleb sat on the other side of Emma's bed. Clara had expected him to do what men in her experience often did in medical emergencies: pace, or defer completely, or become rigid with the particular uselessness of competent people outside their domain. What he did instead was stay. He sat on the other side of the bed and did exactly what Clara told him to do, precisely and without interpretation, which was its own kind of skill. A man setting aside the need to be in charge because being in charge was not what was needed. And the recognizing of this, the actual laying down of it, was something she did not take for granted. Hold her hand, Clara told him, because Emma had been reaching in her delirium, searching fingers. And Caleb reached across the blanket and took his daughter's hand and held it, and Emma's fingers closed around his and stayed. Caleb looked at his daughter's face. Clara, across the bed, watched him look at her and saw something she hadn't seen in him before. A raw, undefended terror. The terror of a man who has already lost something irreplaceable and is now looking straight at the possibility of losing something else, with no walls left to put between himself and the knowing of it. "She's going to be all right," Clara said. She was not certain this was true, but she was certain that it needed to be said, not because he needed a false comfort, but because she believed it. She was choosing to believe it, which was a different thing, which was the thing you did when fear was present and giving up was not an option. "She has to be," he said. It came out barely above a breath. "Then we work," Clara said. "That's all. We just keep working." Otat. The blizzard continued outside with complete indifference. The wind hit the house in long, sustained waves, and the cold came through the window frames despite the rags they'd stuffed there. And the wood stove in the kitchen worked as hard as it could, which was not hard enough to warm the upstairs rooms properly, so Clara made the decision at 6 a.m. to move Emma down. "She needs the kitchen," she told Caleb. "It's the warmest room, and if her temperature goes higher, we need the stove immediately." He carried Emma downstairs, wrapped in every blanket they had, and they set up the kitchen bench with the extra mattress from the spare room and made it into a bed that was not a proper bed but was warm and near the stove and near them. Emma was conscious enough during the transfer to say, with a faint and somehow entirely characteristic irritability, "I'm not that sick." "You really are," Clara told her. "I don't want to sleep in the kitchen." "I know. It smells like onions." "You're the one who left the onions on the counter." A pause. "That's fair," Emma said, and then she was asleep again. Caleb looked at Clara over the sleeping child. Something almost happened to his face. Something between the terrible fear of the last few hours and the recognition that Emma, even sick and burning with fever, was still entirely Emma. Clara saw it and looked back at her work without making anything of it, which was the right thing to do, and she knew it. By mid-morning, Emma's temperature had not broken, but had not risen further, which Clara decided to take as a draw for their side. She was moving on 3 years of experience she'd gotten the hardest way, nursing her husband through a fever that had taken 3 weeks to break and had broken him a little in the process, leaving him diminished in ways that hadn't been obvious at first. She'd learned during those 3 weeks what worked and what was superstition, and what the difference between a fever fighting itself and a fever winning looked like, and she used all of it now, methodically, without narrating it. Caleb moved between Emma and the window and the stove, keeping the fire, bringing water, doing what was needed. Around 10, he said quietly, not looking at Clara, "Margaret died fast. Pneumonia. 3 days from the first fever." He paused. There wasn't time to do anything. She was talking to me in the morning and gone by the 3rd night." Clara kept her eyes on Emma. "This isn't that," she said. "How do you know?" "Because Emma's breathing easy. Her chest is clear. I've been listening." She paused. "This is a hard fever, not a chest sickness. Different." He was quiet. You sure? Sure enough to act like I'm sure. She looked at him then. That's all you can do. Act like you're sure and do the next thing. He nodded, once, and went back to the window. The blizzard was still going. There was no world outside that window, just white and more white, and the sound of the wind doing its one relentless thing. Caleb, she said. He turned. She needs to hear your voice, Claire said. Talk to her. Doesn't matter what about. Just let her hear you. He looked at his daughter's flushed, sleeping face. He pulled the kitchen chair close to the bench and sat down. He talked. Clara moved around the kitchen, doing what needed doing, and listened without appearing to listen. He talked about the ranch, the specific history of it, the years before Emma was born, the first winter he and Margaret had spent here, when they'd been young and unprepared and the stovepipe had failed, and they'd stayed warm by building a fire in the yard and sleeping in the barn because it was warmer than the house. He talked about Margaret in a way he hadn't before, not the careful, abbreviated way of a man managing his grief, but in the fuller, more specific way of a man remembering a person. He talked about the way she'd laughed at things that weren't funny to anyone else. He talked about how she'd had an opinion about every variety of apple, and would discourse at length about why certain ones were inferior and certain ones were the only ones worth eating. And Emma had clearly inherited this specific relationship to fruit, because Emma had already, at 9, established herself as someone who held strong positions on produce. Emma stirred during this last part. Her eyes didn't open, but her face changed. Some subtle softening, the way a person's face changes when they're aware of something even in sleep, when something reaches them through the fever and the dark. Caleb stopped talking. Keep going, Claire said quietly from the stove. He kept going. The fever broke at 2:30 in the afternoon, which Clara knew because she'd been checking Emma's temperature with the back of her wrist every 30 minutes with the careful regularity of someone who doesn't trust improvement until it's sustained and consistent. The breaking was not dramatic. Emma didn't sit up or say anything remarkable. She simply stopped burning. The heat subsided over about 20 minutes into something that was still warm, but was the warmth of a sick child rather than the alarming furnace warmth of the past hours. And Clara sat back in her chair and let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for some time. Caleb was still sitting on his chair by the bench. He was looking at Emma. Her color's better, he said. Yes. Is that? The fever broke, Clara said. She's not out of it completely. She needs water and rest and watching for the next 24 hours. But the worst is done. He looked at Clara. He didn't say anything for a moment. His face was doing the thing it had been doing all day. That open, undefended thing that she'd never seen from him in the ordinary course of their days. The thing that came from having been stripped back to what was actually there. Thank you, he said. That was all. But the way he said it made the two words hold more than they usually do. Clara looked away first. She did the work, she said. Bodies do the work. We just stay with them. Emma woke at dusk, proper consciousness rather than the surface drifting of the fevered hours, and her first coherent sentence was, Is there any broth? Yes, Clara said. Can I have a lot of it? Moderate amount, to start. That's not what I asked, Emma said, with approximately 40% of her normal argumentative energy, which Clara found extraordinarily reassuring. She made the broth strong and warm and brought it in a cup Emma could hold herself, which Emma wanted to do, having established already that she was not to be treated as more helpless than she was. Caleb sat on the chair he'd been in all afternoon. Emma drank the broth and looked at him over the rim of the cup. You talked to me, she said. You were asleep. I heard some of it. She lowered the cup. About Mama and the apples. He looked at her. You heard that. She was quiet for a moment. I like that story. It's not much of a story. It is, Emma said. It's her being a real person. She looked at the cup. You should tell me more of those. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The stove ticked. The storm outside had eased somewhat. Not gone, but reduced, as if it had spent most of its fury in the daylight hours and was now breathing out. I should, he said. I will. Emma seemed to accept this without testing it. She handed the empty cup back to Clara and lay down and was asleep within minutes, her breathing slow and even and cooling toward normal. The storm died around midnight. Clara knew it the same way she'd known it was coming, from the nothing, from the quality of the silence, except that this silence was different from the pre-storm silence. This was the silence of aftermath, the world exhausted and still. She had stayed in the kitchen all evening, dozing in the chair near Emma, waking every hour to check. Caleb had stayed too, in the other chair, neither of them deciding to and neither of them leaving. The wood stove worked steadily. The lamp was low. Outside the windows, the blizzard had become a gentle and occasional drift. Caleb was awake when she woke at midnight. He was looking at the dark window, the cleared sky showing the first stars at the edges of the glass. "It's over," he said. "The storm, yes." He turned to look at her. In the dim lamplight, his face was tired in a way that went past physical tiredness. The tiredness of a person who has spent a full day in the grip of something they had no control over, which was the hardest kind. "I thought—" He stopped. Clara waited. "When her temperature was highest," he said, "there was a moment. I thought about what I'd do if—" He stopped again. "I couldn't get to the end of the thought." "Good," Clara said. He looked at her. "It means you're not done," she said. "People who can get to the end of that thought are already gone somewhere. You couldn't, which means you're still here." She paused. "She needs you to still be here." He was quiet for a while. Emma's breathing filled the kitchen, slow and regular. "I've been here," he said, "and not here at the same time. For years." "I know." "Is that—" He stopped a third time, and this time the stopping was different. The stopping of a man choosing whether to say a true thing out loud. "Is that fixable?" Clara looked at him steadily. This question had a particular weight to it. She could feel the weight of everything that had built toward it. All the months, and the small daily repairs, and the morning conversations, and the night in the barn, and the photograph on the shelf, and this day, this entire terrible and clarifying day. "Yes," she said. She said it without hesitation, which was its own choice. Not in one go, and not without, "It'll cost you something to be here properly. It means staying when it's hard and when it's frightening and when you don't know what to do. Today was that. You stayed today. You told me to. You would have stayed anyway." He considered this. She could see him deciding whether to believe it about himself. "Maybe," he said. "You didn't leave that room," she said quietly. "Not once, all day. You held her hand and you talked to her and you didn't leave." She paused. "That wasn't me. That was you." The lamp guttered slightly. Emma shifted in her sleep, turned toward the warmth of the stove, her face peaceful in the way that only genuinely sleeping, no longer suffering, people are peaceful. Caleb looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. There was something in the looking that was different from the way he'd looked at her across every meal and every morning coffee and every practical negotiation of the shared days. It was different because the day had taken down what was usually between them. Not hostility, there had never been hostility, but the careful maintenance of appropriate distance, the management of what was acknowledged and what was not. And what was underneath it was just two people who had been through something together, who had carried the same thing through the same long hours, and who were still here on the other side of it. He looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them moved or said anything. The moment lasted exactly as long as it could without becoming a declaration, and then Clara looked down at her hands in her lap, and he looked back at Emma, and the kitchen was quiet and warm, and the stars outside were sharp and cold in the clear post-storm sky. Neither of them spoke again. They stayed where they were, in their separate chairs, on opposite sides of the sleeping child, through the rest of the night, not talking, not needing to, held in the particular stillness of people who have said more than they've said and know it and are not, for the first time afraid of the knowing. Emma recovered slowly, the way children do when the body has spent everything it had and needs time to rebuild its accounts. The first 2 days after the fever broke, she slept most of the time, waking to eat and drink and argue mildly about being kept in the kitchen, which Clara allowed her to do because the arguing was a reliable indicator of returning health. Emma, at less than full capacity, was quiet and acquiescent, and quiet acquiescence in Emma was more alarming than complaint. By the third day, she was sitting up. By the fourth, she was at the table with her notebook, updating her storm inventory with an annotator's precision, adding columns for what had been used during the illness and what needed replacing. Caleb watched this from across the table without making it obvious that he was watching. He'd developed the habit over the past months, but it was sharper now, post-storm, post-fever. He watched his daughter the way a man watches something he came close to losing, with a quality of attention that was not anxious exactly, but was more conscious than before, more deliberate. Present in the way Clara had asked him to be, except that now he didn't need to be asked. "You don't have to keep looking at me like that," Emma said, without looking up from her notebook. "I'm not looking at you like anything. You're checking to see if I'm all right every 4 minutes." She turned a page. "I'm all right. You were very sick." "I know, I was there." She paused, conceded slightly. "But I'm better now." Caleb picked up his coffee. "Your color's still off." "It's winter. Everyone's pale in winter." "You're talking about produce again," Clara said from the stove, not turning around. She had an opinion about the turnips yesterday, too. Emma pointed her pencil at Clara in vindication. The turnips were soft. Soft turnips are not acceptable. "The turnips survived a blizzard," Clara said. "They're allowed to be slightly soft." "Slightly," Emma said. These were more than slightly. Caleb looked between them. Something in his chest did the thing it had been doing more frequently in recent weeks. A kind of warmth that he'd stopped trying to classify and had started simply allowing, the way you allow something that is good and that you've decided not to argue with. He drank his coffee and let them argue about the turnips and was glad, in a specific and conscious way, to be sitting in this kitchen, in this noise, in this ordinary, unremarkable morning. Clara noticed the change in him after the storm in the way she noticed most things, gradually and then with sudden clarity, the way a landscape reveals itself when the fog lifts all at once. He talked more, not dramatically more. He was still Caleb Mercer, a man for whom silence was a native language. But the quality of his speech had changed. Before the storm, when he spoke, it was functional, answering what was asked or relaying what was necessary. Now he sometimes spoke without being asked. A detail about the day, or an observation about the cattle, or occasionally something about Emma that he addressed to Clara directly, not because Clara needed the information, but because he wanted to say it to someone who would understand why it mattered. "She told me yesterday she wants to learn to ride the North Range alone," he said one morning when Emma was upstairs. "Not just the near pasture, the full North Range." "What did you say?" "Said she needed to be stronger first, told her spring." He paused. "She already started planning it, drew a map." Clara smiled at the preserves she was sorting. "Of course she did." "She drew it on the back of the turnip inventory," he said, and there was something in his voice, dry and fond and tired all at once, the voice of a man who has been fully seen by someone smaller than him and has decided to be worthy of it. They stood in the kitchen for a moment in the comfortable way they'd started standing sometimes, near each other and not performing anything. "She's going to be something," Clara said. "She already is," Caleb said. He said it quietly, like a man making a private correction to years of an error. It was Nora Fitch who set the events of December in motion, though not intentionally, or perhaps intentionally, in the particular way of women who believe they're helping and are not wrong exactly, but are not entirely right either. She came out to the ranch again 10 days after the storm, in the period when the roads had been broken and travel was possible again, though not comfortable. She came with a jar of preserved pears, which was genuine kindness, and with the particular set of her shoulders that meant she had something to say that she'd been working up to. Clara let her in and made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table. Emma was upstairs, Caleb was in the barn, and Nora made conversation for about 4 minutes before she got to the thing she'd come to get to. "There's been talk," she said. Clara waited. "About you and Caleb. About the arrangement here. About what it is." "The arrangement is the same as it's always been," Clara said. "Housekeeper." "That's what I've told people," Nora said, with a slight emphasis on the word told that made the word mean something more complicated. "But the storm. You were all three out here for 5 days. And people know about Emma being ill. And they know you stayed and managed it, which," she paused, "which I think is to your credit, genuinely. But you know how people construct things. I know, Clara said. The concern, the legitimate concern, and I want to be clear that my concern is legitimate. Nora set down her teacup. Is Emma, her name. Her standing in this town. She's going to grow up here. What people think of her family matters. Clara looked at Nora steadily. What do you think they should think? I think they should think that Caleb Mercer is a respectable man who employs a capable housekeeper, and that is the entirety of what there is to think. She paused. But for that to be what they think, the line between those two things needs to be clear. The kitchen was quiet. Clara turned her teacup in its saucer. And you're telling me this, Clara said, rather than Caleb, because… Nora was quiet for a moment. Because you seem like a woman who can manage a conversation like this without becoming difficult, Clara said. I was going to say emotional. They're often used interchangeably, Clara said, and her voice was level, for women who raise objections. Nora had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. That's fair, she said. Clara stood and refilled the tea without having decided whether to refill the tea, a social reflex that bought her a moment. What she felt, standing at the stove with the kettle in her hand, was something complicated, something that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, and was partly neither of those things, was partly just the familiar tiredness of being a woman in a specific circumstance, in a world that has already decided what your circumstance means and is offering you the choice to either confirm or contest its interpretation, with consequences either way. She was a housekeeper. That was the true thing. That was what she'd come here as and what the arrangement was and what she'd reminded herself of regularly when other feelings made the boundaries of that arrangement feel less solid. She wasn't unaware of what Nora Fitch was actually describing, wasn't unaware that the town's construction of things was not entirely baseless, was in fact a correct reading of something real, just not a correct reading of anything that had happened or been said or been acted on. She brought the tea back to the table and sat down. You're right that Emma's standing in this town matters, she said. She's going to need people here, people who will treat her as Caleb Mercer's capable daughter rather than as some kind of footnote. I understand that. She paused. What I'd push back on is the idea that the way to protect that standing is to make the lines clearer between myself and this family, as if the problem is my proximity to them. Then what is the problem? Nora said. The problem, Clara said, is that Caleb Mercer has spent 6 years not showing up to town meetings and not engaging with people and not correcting what they've decided to think about him and his daughter. That's the problem. Not me. Nora was quiet. If people think poorly of Emma, Clara said, it's because they've been given no reason to think otherwise. No one stood up and said anything different. And that's not something I can fix from inside this house. She said this without particular force, without the trembling delivery of someone afraid of the words coming out of their mouth. She said it the way she said things that she'd thought through and was sure of. Nora drove back to Harlow Creek. Caleb heard about it from Clara that evening after Emma was in bed. She told him what Nora had said and what she'd said back, plainly and in the same order it had happened, without editorializing. She told him because she'd decided he needed to know, and because not telling him would have been a kind of management, a decision made on his behalf, and she'd decided some months ago that she wasn't going to manage Caleb Mercer's life. She was going to be honest with him and let him manage it himself. He listened all the way through without interrupting, which was typical of him. He listened to completion, never cut in. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. She's not wrong, he said, about some of it. No. I've let people think what they want. About everything. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. About Margaret dying, about Emma, about what this ranch is. It was easier than… He stopped. Than engaging with it, Clara said. Yes, that's over now, Clara said. Not harshly, just factually. He looked at her. You think I should go into town? I think you should do what you think is right. She paused. But I also think Emma deserves someone who shows up for her in public, not just out here where no one can see it. I show up for her. Out here you do. You've been doing it. But the people in that town don't see out here. They see you at the general store and at the feed dealer and at the post office, not talking to anyone, not setting any records straight, and they fill in what they don't know with what they've decided. He stood up. He went to the window. The night outside was clear and cold, and the stars were that brilliant, hard clarity of winter. "What would you have me do exactly, but," he said. "Go in there and announce what?" "I don't know what you'd announce," Clara said. "That's yours to figure out. I'm telling you the situation. The decision is yours." He was quiet for a long time. She didn't fill the silence. "They think you're—" He stopped, started again. "What they're implying about you, it's not—" He turned from the window. "It's not right. You've been nothing but— You've conducted yourself—" "I know how I've conducted myself," Clara said. "The question isn't what I know. It's what you're going to do about what they don't." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was committing to something, rather than just agreeing with it. He rode into Harlow Creek on a Thursday. He hadn't planned for Thursday specifically. It simply arrived and the weather was passable, and Emma was at school, and he'd lain awake Wednesday night not sleeping and gotten up Thursday morning and saddled the horse before he'd made any explicit decision, which was sometimes how his decisions worked best, when his body moved ahead of the part of his mind that would have found objections. He went to the feed dealer first, which was practical, and gave him a reason to be in town that wasn't the actual reason. He settled his account and made arrangements for spring and was on his way to the door when he ran into Tom Rigby, who ran the livery and was one of those men who had been in a town long enough to believe that longevity conveyed a particular kind of authority. "Caleb," Rigby said. He said it with the particular warmth of someone who is about to say something that isn't warm. "Haven't seen you in a while. How's the ranch coming through the winter?" "Fine," Caleb said. "Heard you had a time of it during the storm. Your girl was sick." "She was. She's recovered." "That's good. That's real good." Rigby nodded with the satisfaction of a man checking a box. "Heard your housekeeper managed it." "We both did," Caleb said. Rigby's expression went to the particular configuration of a man who has been waiting for an opening and has found one. Right. Your housekeeper. Folks have been wondering. I mean, a woman living out there at the ranch, just the three of you, and she was there for the storm, all those days." "Clara Hale," Caleb said, "is a good woman who has kept my house, tended my daughter, and managed more in 7 months than most people manage in years." He kept his voice even. "If people are wondering about the arrangement is that she is part of my household, and she has my complete respect. If that needs clarifying, consider it clarified." Rigby looked at him, recalibrating. "I wasn't implying anything untoward." "No," Caleb said, "but someone was, or you wouldn't be bringing it to me sideways like this." He picked up his hat from the counter where he'd set it. "Good day, Tom." He walked out, which was easier than he'd expected, and then his heart was doing something loud and irregular in his chest that was mostly adrenaline and partly the strangeness of having said a true thing out loud in a place where true things cost something. He stood on the board sidewalk in the cold air for a moment. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. Saying it to Tom Rigby, who would repeat it in a slightly altered form to 6 other people, who would each alter it again, was not the same as saying it where it could not be altered. He turned and looked down the main street of Harlow Creek and thought about where people gathered on a Thursday and what he was willing to do about the thing he'd said he would do. The Mercantile on Calley Street was the closest thing Harlow Creek had to a community center on weekdays, not because anyone had designated it as such, but because it had a long counter, a wood stove, and a policy of not requiring purchase for the use of either, which meant that on cold mornings and cold afternoons, it accumulated the particular population of people who have nowhere to be urgently and something to say. Caleb walked in at 10:30. There were 7 people in the store. He knew all of them, the way you know everyone in a small town, by name and by the particular texture of their relationship to you, which in Caleb's case was mostly distant. Headley behind the counter. Nora Fitch, who looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. 2 men from the north claims he knew by sight. A woman named Aldra Prentice, who ran the schoolhouse and had, over the years, sent him 4 separate notes about Emma that he'd read and not responded to. And 2 others, older women whose names he knew but whose faces he sometimes confused, who were examining fabrics at the far end of the counter. He walked to the middle of the store and stood there in the way that a man stands when he has decided to be unmissable, and the conversations quieted in the graduated way of a room becoming aware that something is different. I want to say something, Caleb said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. To whoever's present and to pass on to whoever isn't. Headley set down what he was doing. Nora turned fully toward him. Aldra Prentice looked up from the letter she'd been reading. There's been talk about Clara Hale, Caleb said, about what she is to my household. I know there's been talk because it's gotten back to me in 3 different conversations in 2 weeks, and this town is not large enough for things to travel that distance without someone helping them along. The store was fully quiet now. I want to be clear about what Clara Hale is, he said. She came to my ranch 7 months ago when my daughter needed someone and I wasn't, when I hadn't been doing right by her. What Clara did in those 7 months is repair a home that I'd let come apart. She taught my daughter things I should have taught her. She sat with Emma through the storm when Emma was running a fever that would have scared most people into paralysis, and she kept her calm, and she kept her working, and she kept Emma alive through the worst of it. He paused. She's done that by being a person of complete integrity in my house, every single day, without complaint and without asking for anything beyond what she was due. No one spoke. He continued. So when people suggest otherwise, when people imply that there's something improper about her presence in my home, or use language about her that implies she is something less than what she is, they are wrong, and they are wrong about someone who deserves better than to be the subject of that kind of conversation. He let that sit for a moment. Clara Hale is not my housekeeper in the way people seem to be using that word. She is a member of this family. She is the person who put this family back together. And she will be treated accordingly by me, and I would appreciate it if she were treated accordingly by this town. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room that has just been given information it didn't have and is in the process of reorganizing itself around it. Nora Fitch was the first one to move. She nodded once, a small, deliberate nod that was something between acknowledgement and approval. Aldra Prentice had put down her letter entirely and was looking at Caleb with the expression of a woman revising an opinion she'd held for years. Headley said, "Well," which was Headley's version of a complete sentence. Caleb picked up the few things he'd actually needed from the store, paid for them without rushing, and walked back out into the cold. Tumkit. He rode back to the ranch slowly, not because the horse needed the slow pace, but because he did. Because something had shifted inside him that needed a little time and open air to settle into its new position. He'd been a man who did not speak publicly. He'd been a man who let the town think what it thought and looked away from the costs of that. He'd been a man who'd buried his grief so deep that it had taken someone else coming in from outside to excavate even the edges of it. And none of those things were going to change entirely, because you don't change the fundamental shape of yourself just because you've had a hard year and said something honest in a store on a Thursday. He knew that. But he'd said it. He'd stood in the middle of a room that had decided things about his household, and he'd told them they were wrong, and he'd used Clara's name in the same breath as the word family. And it had been true when he said it, which was the thing that still surprised him slightly. Not the saying of it, but the truth of it. The fact that when he went looking for the word that fit, that was the word he'd found. He thought about Clara the way he'd been trying not to think about Clara for the better part of 3 months. He thought about the night of the storm, the two of them in their chairs on opposite sides of Emma, the lamp burning low, the way she'd looked at him when he'd said, "Neither am I." He thought about the barn in July, her standing near the door, near the exit, the way she'd said what she'd said with the plainness of someone who doesn't dress up what they mean. He thought about the morning coffees and the photograph on the shelf and the garden with the marigolds that were brown and dead now under the snow but would come back in spring. He was certain they would come back. He thought about what he'd said in the store, member of this family. He'd meant it as a defense, as a statement of her standing. But he was aware, riding back through the flat white winter country, that it was also a statement of something else, of something he hadn't said and wasn't sure yet how to say, and wasn't sure he had the right to say, because Clara Hale had a life before this ranch, and reasons of her own for being here, and had never, in 7 months, given him any indication that she wanted anything from this situation beyond what they'd agreed to in the beginning. She was careful. She was deliberately careful. He'd noticed this the way he noticed things about her that he'd been trying not to catalog, the way she kept her room and her distance, and the clear professional boundary of herself, not coldly, but deliberately, as if she'd drawn a line and was honoring it with both hands. He didn't know what was on the other side of that line. He didn't know if he was allowed to ask. He got back to the ranch at noon. Clara was in the kitchen. Emma was not yet back from school. He came in and took off his coat and hat, and she set a plate on the table. Food she'd made, the ordinary miracle of it, food that was ready when he came in because she'd been there all morning and had timed things. And he sat down and she sat across from him with her own plate, the way they ate when Emma wasn't there, the two of them at the table without ceremony. He said, "I went into town." She looked up. He told her what he'd said. Not exactly, not word for word, but the shape of it, who'd been there, what he'd said about her, how he'd said it. He told her without performing it, without making it sound like more than it was. Just a man in a store saying a true thing to people who'd been saying an untrue one. Clara was quiet through the telling. She looked at her plate for some of it. When he finished, she didn't say anything immediately, and he didn't push. He'd learned not to push, with her. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know. It'll change things, how people talk." That was the point. She looked at him then, directly, which she did, but which still felt significant when it happened, a thing he registered differently than being looked at by other people. "Thank you," she said. The same two words he'd said to her the night of the storm, but she said them differently. She said them carefully, with an awareness of their weight. "You deserve someone saying it," he said. "Should have been said before now." She nodded. She looked at her food. He looked at his food. They ate for a minute in the quiet. Then she said, "You used the word family." He didn't look up. "Yes. That's a big word." "It's the right one," he said. She was quiet again for a long moment. He could feel her thinking, turning it over the way she turned things over, carefully, from all sides, before she decided what she thought. "It is," she said finally. "For me too. I want you to know that. This place, Emma, it's more than the position. It has been for a while." He looked up. She was looking at him, and what was in her face was not the careful managed thing it usually was, but something under that, the thing she kept behind the management, which was a person who had been through her own losses and had come to this place with her own scars and had stayed, had chosen to stay, not from need exactly, but from something that had grown past need. "I know," he said. "I wasn't sure you did. I wasn't sure I was allowed to." She looked at him for a moment. Outside, a gust of wind moved across the yard and sent a lift of snow off the eaves, a brief, soft sound. "I'm going to need some time," she said. I'm not saying no to anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm just saying I move slowly with things that matter." "I know that about you," he said. "You're all right with slow?" "I've got nowhere to be," he said. Something happened to her face then. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the thing underneath a smile. She turned back to her plate. "Eat," she said. "It'll get cold." He ate. She ate. The kitchen was warm and the winter light came in through Margaret's curtains and lay across the table in pale stripes. Cook. Emma came home from school at 3:30 and immediately sensed that something had shifted, the way children sense things by reading the atmosphere of a room before they've understood the facts of it. She stood in the doorway and looked between Caleb and Clara, who were both in the kitchen doing ordinary things. Caleb at the table with the ranch ledger, Clara at the stove, and she looked between them the way she'd been looking between them for weeks, measuring something she couldn't quite name. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing alarming," Clara said. "Something happened," Emma said. "The room is different." Caleb looked up from the ledger. "I went to town today." Emma pulled off her coat, hung it herself on the peg she'd claimed. "And?" "And I said some things that needed to be said." Emma was quiet, looking at him. She had her mother's directness. He saw it now, all the time, the way she went straight at the center of things without circling. "About what?" she said. "About what this family is," he said. "About Clara. About how this household works and who's in it." Emma's expression went through several things very quickly, processing, understanding, and then settling into something that was more complicated than simple relief, more complicated than just being glad. "Did you say it well?" she said. He considered this. "I think so." "Did people listen?" "Some will, some won't." That's how it goes. Emma nodded slowly. She looked at Clara. Clara was stirring something and not looking up, but her posture had a quality of attention that Emma recognized, the way Clara was always listening even when she wasn't appearing to. Good, Emma said. She said it simply, without decoration. The way she said things she meant completely. She got her notebook from her bag and sat at the table and opened it. After a moment she said without looking up, Clara, can we plant the marigolds earlier this year? Depends on the frost, Clara said. But in theory. In theory, yes. Emma wrote something in the notebook. I want more of them this year, she said, and I want to plant them myself. We can do that, Clara said. Emma kept writing. Caleb looked at the ledger without reading it. The stove made its small, steady sounds, and the afternoon light shifted on the walls. And outside the winter country lay flat and cold and patient in every direction. The house held them. It held them the way a house holds people who have earned it. Not perfectly. Nothing about any of this had been or would be perfect. But genuinely, with the accumulated weight of months of meals and arguments and repaired doors and songs nobody sang but that played underneath everything anyway. Caleb looked at his daughter. He looked at the woman at the stove. He opened the ledger and began actually reading it, which was perhaps the most ordinary thing that had happened in this kitchen in 7 months, and therefore, in its way, the most extraordinary. He was present. He was here. He stayed. The marigolds went in on the last Saturday of April. Emma had been planning it since February, which was the kind of thing Emma did. She committed to something and then organized everything upstream of it with the focused intensity of a person who has discovered that planning is one of the few things entirely within your control when the world is not. She had a diagram. She had a planting schedule. She had opinions, strongly held, about spacing. Clara let her lead it. This was deliberate. She handed Emma the trowel and stepped back and answered questions when asked, and offered corrections only when the correction was genuinely necessary, which was less often than Emma expected and more often than Emma wanted to admit. The girl was good with growing things. She had the patience for it, which surprised people who knew her only as the argumentative, quick-moving child she was everywhere else. In the garden, she slowed down. She looked at things carefully before she did them. Caleb came out mid-morning and stood at the edge of the garden watching. He had his coffee, which he'd started taking outside in better weather. Another shift, small, the kind that accumulates. She drew a map of where each one goes, he said to Clara. I know, I've seen the map, several versions of it. The third version was better than the second one. She added a legend, Clara said, color-coded. He shook his head, not in frustration, but in the way you shake your head at something that has gotten past you in the best possible sense. Emma was on her knees in the dirt, entirely absorbed, her hair falling forward, talking to herself slightly in the way she did when she was concentrating hard on something physical. She's going to want to expand it again next year, Clara said. She already mentioned it, Caleb said. She wants the whole south side of the house. That's ambitious. She's ambitious. He said it simply, without the complicated weight such an observation might have carried a year ago. Without the guilt underneath it, the awareness of how long he hadn't seen what was right in front of him. He'd been working through that guilt for months, not loudly, not in ways he narrated, but working through it the way you work through a hard winter. One day at a time, without expecting the thaw to arrive on any particular schedule. She gets it from somewhere, Clara said. He glanced at her. She was looking at the garden, not at him, but the corner of her mouth had that quality it sometimes had, the thing that preceded a smile without quite becoming one. Her mother, he said. Maybe, Clara said, and maybe other places. He didn't respond to this, but he stayed where he was and drank his coffee while Emma planted marigolds in her color-coded diagram's precise locations, and the morning moved around them in the unhurried way of spring mornings when the worst of winter is genuinely past. The town had changed toward them, not dramatically and not without residue, but changed. It happened the way attitudinal changes happen in small communities, not through any single conversion, but through the slow accumulation of revised small encounters, the adjustments people make to their understanding of a situation when new information comes in and they're honest enough to update. Caleb had said what he'd said in Headley's store in December. Headley had repeated it, as expected, which meant it had reached most of Harlow Creek within 48 hours. What surprised Caleb was not that people had heard it, but what they'd done with it. The ones he expected to dismiss it had mostly done so, but the ones who'd been uncertain had, one by one, adjusted. Aldra Prentice had stopped by the ranch in January, ostensibly to check on Emma's studies during her recovery, and actually, it became clear, to form her own opinion of Clara Hale in person. She'd stayed 2 hours, drunk 3 cups of tea, and left with an expression that Caleb read as one of revised assessment. Emma noticed it at school first, in the way the other children treated her, which had been the most reliable meter of how the adults were talking. Dora Hewitt asked me if I wanted to sit with her at lunch, Emma reported one evening in February, with the precise neutrality of someone reporting a fact whose significance they haven't yet decided on. "And did you?" Clara asked. "I said I'd think about it." Emma ate a bite of potato. "She was never particularly kind before." "People change," Clara said. "Do they? Or do they just change how they act when the situation changes?" Caleb set down his fork. He looked at his daughter with the full attention he'd been practicing. "That's a real question," he said, "and the honest answer is that it's both, depending on the person. Some people change their behavior, and the change is only surface. They're kind to you now because being unkind has a cost they didn't expect. And some people change their behavior and then change underneath it too, because they realize something." He paused. "You won't know which one Dora Hewitt is until you give her the time to show you." Emma considered this with the gravity she brought to things her father said, which was a different gravity from how she considered other things. More weight, more care, as if she was aware that she had limited examples of him speaking plainly and wanted to do right by each one. "I'll sit with her," Emma decided. "Once." "That seems fair," Caleb said. Clara said nothing, which was the right thing, because this was between the two of them, and she had learned, over the months, the particular skill of knowing which conversations she was in and which ones she was near but not part of, and honoring that distinction even when it was difficult. She was learning other distinctions too, in that winter. The distinction between being in a household and being part of one. The distinction between being needed and being wanted. They can coexist, and they did here, but they were not the same thing, and the difference mattered. Caleb asked her in March. He didn't make a ceremony of it, which was consistent with who he was and which she would not have wanted him to change. They were in the kitchen after supper, Emma upstairs, the dishes done, the ordinary decompression of the end of a day, and he said without preamble, the way he said things he'd been working up to for a while, "I want to talk to you about staying." Clara looked up from the mending she'd been doing. "Not as the housekeeper," he said. "I want to talk about a real arrangement, a permanent one." He paused. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to know that the offer is there and that it's not conditional on anything except whether you want it." She set down the mending. She looked at him directly, which was always a significant thing between them, the full direct look rather than the managed peripheral attention they used for the middle-distance conversations. "What does the arrangement look like?" she said. "Specifically, the ranch is half yours if you stay. It's not a gesture. It's what's fair." He put his hands on the table. "You've put 7 months of work into this place. The garden, the house, Emma." He stopped on Emma's name. "She's not mine to offer. She's her own person. But she—" "I know," Clara said quietly. "I know what Emma is." "Then you know that stays regardless," he said. "Whatever you decide, you're her. You're in her life. That doesn't depend on any decision you make about me." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the March night was clear and cold, and the stars were the bright specific stars of a place far from any city, the stars that look like they're actually there, rather than like a backdrop. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it without trying to fix it or respond to it too quickly." He waited. "When my husband died, I made a decision," she said. "I decided I was done expecting things from life, I wasn't bitter. I just decided that I'd had my share of things I'd hoped for, and most of them had gone wrong, and the better strategy was to work for what was in front of me and not plan beyond it." She looked at her hands. "That's what I was doing when I came here, working for what was in front of me, not expecting anything beyond the position." "And now?" he said. She looked up. And now I'm sitting in a kitchen that I know better than any place I've lived in years, talking to a man who said my name in the middle of a room full of people and called me family. She paused. And I'm trying to figure out whether I still believe what I decided after my husband died, or whether that decision was a way of protecting myself that made sense then and makes less sense now. I'm not going to tell you which one it is, Caleb said. I know you're not. But I'll tell you what I think, he said. I think you made that decision because you had to. I think it kept you functional when functional was the best you could do. And I think... He stopped and started again with the careful deliberateness of a man who doesn't speak carelessly and who is choosing to speak anyway. I think you know the difference between protecting yourself and hiding. I think you've known that for a while. She looked at him for a long moment. The stove ticked. The house breathed around them. Yes, she said. I've known it for a while. So, he said. So, she said. And then, after a pause that held everything the past 8 months had been building toward, yes. She said it quietly, without theater. One word, plainly delivered, like most of the true things she said. He nodded. He didn't reach across the table or say anything else immediately. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And what passed between them was not the dramatic current of a romance novel, but something more durable than that. The specific recognition of two people who have been through something real together and have come out the other side and are choosing clearly and without illusion to go forward in the same direction. We should tell Emma, he said. In the morning, Clara said. Let her sleep. She's going to have a lot of questions. She has a lot of questions about everything. This is different. Yes, Clara said, but she'll manage them the way she manages everything. She picked up the mending again. One at a time, with a diagram if necessary. He laughed. It was the laugh she'd heard grow more frequent over the months. Not a social laugh, not the performance of humor, but the real thing, short and unguarded and completely his own. She smiled at the mending in her lap. Outside, the March wind moved over the flat country without hurry, the way it always moved out there, indifferent and enormous, and strangely comforting in its consistency. Emma did have questions. She came down in the morning and sat across from both of them at the kitchen table, which they'd arranged themselves at simultaneously in a way that signaled, even before anyone spoke, that something deliberate was happening. Emma read this in approximately 4 seconds and set down her cup and looked between them. You're going to tell me something, she said. We are, Caleb said. He told her. Not everything, not the conversation the night before in its full detail, but the shape of it, the decision. Clara was staying permanently as part of the family, and the ranch would be hers as much as it was his, and things were going to be different in the ways that things changed when the people in a house stopped pretending they weren't becoming what they were already becoming. Emma listened all the way through, which was not always guaranteed with Emma. She listened and then she was quiet, and her quiet had a different quality from her thinking quiet. This was something more interior, something she was deciding how to speak about. Are you going to get married? She said. Caleb glanced at Clara. Clara looked at Emma. That's a conversation for later, Clara said. That usually means yes, but complicated, Emma said. It means it's a conversation for later, Clara said, with a firmness that Emma recognized and accepted as a boundary rather than an evasion, which was a distinction Clara had taught her to make. Emma looked at her father. Are you happy? She said. Caleb seemed caught slightly off guard by the directness of it, which was always the risk with Emma. He looked at his daughter. This particular child, this serious and sharp and deeply feeling person who'd been asking him to show up for years without ever quite using those words. And he said, Yes. Are you? Emma thought about it the way she thought about real questions, not as a courtesy, but as a genuine inquiry. Yes, she said. I think I've been getting there for a while. She picked up her cup again. I'm going to need to update the garden diagram. The marigolds, Clara said. I want to add something for this, like a record, a row of something that marks when things changed. She was already reaching for her notebook. What do you think would grow well on the east side? It gets more sun in the morning. They talked about the garden. Clara had suggestions. Caleb had soil observations from years of working that ground. Emma synthesized them into her notebook with the focused attention she'd given the storm inventory and the turnip records and every other thing she'd decided mattered enough to document. It was an ordinary conversation. It was also nothing of the sort. Spring moved over the flatlands the way it always did. Gradually, and then suddenly, one morning warm enough that the remaining snow retreated to shadows and stayed there. The garden grew. Emma's marigolds came in strong, which she took a proprietary satisfaction in that Clara did not undermine, because the satisfaction was earned. Emma had put them in right, had given them the space they needed, had watered carefully and not overwatered, which was the more common sin. The east side addition she'd planned through March was a row of yellow-hearted cone flowers that Clara had found the seeds for in Harlow Creek, and they went in May and were slow to start, and Emma checked them every day with the diligence of a person who has learned that watching something closely is not the same as controlling it, but is the best you can do. Caleb spent the spring on the ranch improvements he'd been deferring for 2 years, not because he hadn't had the money exactly, but because he hadn't had the reason, the forward-looking intention that makes improvement feel worth the effort. He repaired the far fence line. He negotiated with a neighbor for a better arrangement on the east pasture water rights. He started planning for the following year in a way that required believing there would be a following year, which sounds simple and is not simple, which is, in fact, one of the harder things a person can do after they've decided to stop expecting things to continue. Clara watched him work with the same peripheral attention she'd been watching him with since October. She noticed the difference not as a dramatic transformation, but as a gradual accumulation of small evidence. He came to supper without being called. He initiates conversations with Emma about her school day without prompting. He asked Clara one Tuesday morning what she thought they should do about the East Garden bed, not in the way of a man delegating a task, but in the way of a man asking for a genuine second opinion from someone whose judgment he trusts. These were small things. She'd learned to measure by small things. She'd also been paying attention to herself, which was harder. She had a tendency, which she recognized and didn't fully trust herself to have overcome, toward self-erasure, toward defining herself primarily in terms of what she was doing for others and what she was to other people, rather than what she simply was in herself. It was a tendency she'd noticed in her marriage too, the way she'd organized her own wants around her husband's life, as if her own wants were the secondary document rather than the primary one. She'd made peace with this in ways that weren't entirely peace, which was another thing her husband's illness and death had left her with. Not just the grief, but the unresolved question of what she would have been if she'd let herself find out. She was finding out now, slowly, at 41, in a kitchen off the flatland with a garden she'd built herself and a child who argued with her about botany and a man who'd said her name in a room full of people as if it were something he was proud to say. It was not the life she'd planned. She'd stopped being certain sometime in the winter that this was a relevant observation. Life didn't particularly care what you'd planned for it. It offered what it offered, and the question was always what you did with what was in front of you, whether you worked with it or turned away from it, whether you were present for it or absent, whether you let yourself have it when having it was actually being offered. She was letting herself have it. That was the work she was doing, quiet and daily, and without announcement. The question of the town resolved itself in the way that small-town questions resolve, not with a verdict, but with a gradual shift in the social weather, a slow warming that you only notice in retrospect when you realize you've stopped bracing for the cold. Aldra Prentice became something approaching an ally. She was a practical woman who made decisions based on what she observed rather than what she was told, and what she observed over the spring and into summer was Emma Mercer arriving at school on time, prepared, with her work done and her clothes fitting, asking questions in class with a confidence she hadn't had the previous year, sitting at lunch sometimes with Dora Hewitt and sometimes with other children, and navigating all of it with the particular social competence of a child who has learned at home that her voice is worth using. Aldra mentioned this to Clara in June at the tail end of a conversation at the general store that had begun about school term supplies and had arrived somehow at this. "She's a different child than she was," Aldra said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation about a fact, which was the mode Clara had come to respect, in Aldra and in the few people like her she'd found in this town. "She was always this child," Clara said. "She just needed more room." Aldra looked at her. "You gave her that," She took it, Clara said. That's different. I just didn't shut the door on her when she reached for it. This answer seemed to land in some useful place with Aldra, who nodded and moved on and said nothing more about it. But she mentioned Emma's improvement to two other families whose children were in her school, and those families mentioned it to their children, and those children, in the particular social alchemy of childhood, revised their understanding of Emma Mercer without being asked to, and without, probably, being aware they were doing it. Nora Fitch came to the ranch once more, in July, with preserved pears again. A regularity that Clara suspected was becoming Nora's version of an apology she didn't quite know how to make any other way. She was different on this visit, less formal, less positioned. She sat at the kitchen table and looked around at the house. The fixed cabinet, the clean curtains, the shelf with Margaret's photograph visible, and something moved through her expression that wasn't easy to name. She would have liked you, Nora said. Margaret? Clara asked. She had no patience for managed people, Nora said. People who were careful all the time. She said she could always tell when someone was being the version of themselves they'd practiced, and she couldn't stand it. She paused. You don't practice yourself. Clara thought about this. I've had to practice other things, she said. There wasn't much left over for appearances. That's what she liked, Nora said, in people, the ones who'd used up their energy on real things. They sat with this for a moment, the two women, in the kitchen of a house that had belonged to a woman neither of them would ever meet, that had been kept and repaired and made into something by the living rather than the dead, the way it has to be. Clara poured more tea. Emma rode the North Range alone in August. This had been negotiated across 3 conversations and 1 formal written proposal. Emma had submitted a document that outlined her qualifications, her planned route, her contingency plan for 3 different emergencies including weather, her horse's fitness level, and a hand-drawn map with markers. Caleb had read the proposal at the kitchen table without speaking. He'd turned to the last page. He'd looked at Clara. She cited you, he said, in the proposal, listed you as a character reference. Clara had taken the proposal and looked at the last page. Emma had written, in her large, careful handwriting, character reference Clara Hale Mercer, who has demonstrated consistently that capable people should be trusted with things that matter to them. Hale Mercer, Caleb said. I noticed, Clara said. They'd both looked at the document for a moment. I'll talk to her, Clara said. Don't change it, Caleb said, and then seemed slightly surprised that he'd said it. Clara looked at him. He looked back. All right, she said. Emma rode the North Range on a clear August morning, alone, carrying a canteen and her emergency plan, and returning exactly when she'd said she'd return, coming back to the yard at a trot, with her hair flying loose and her face having the particular quality of a person who has done something they weren't certain they could do and has found out they could. She dismounted and unsaddled her horse with practiced movements, and came to the porch where both Clara and Caleb had been, let's say, not quite waiting, and reported on the ride with the precision of someone whose audience is the quality of the journey, not just its completion. The 3rd fence post from the cottonwood is still bad, she said. Caleb looked at her. I fixed that post. It's going again. He turned to look toward the north pasture, even though it wasn't visible from here. I'll get to it. I marked it on the map, Emma said, and went inside. Caleb looked at Clara. She really did cite you as a reference, he said. She's not wrong, technically, Clara said. She's watched how I approach things. She's making an argument from evidence. She's 9. She'll be 10 in October, Clara said, and she's been watching and learning since before we knew she was. He looked out toward the north pasture, at the range Emma had just ridden alone for the first time. The country was summer gold out there, the flatlands going all the way to the low hills in the west, enormous and indifferent and entirely, permanently itself. My wife would have loved watching her grow up, he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. I know. She'd have been better at some of it than I've been. She'd have been better at some things, Clara said. You've been better than you give yourself credit for. I wasn't there for years. You're here now. She looked at him. That's not nothing. That's actually most of the work. Being here now. People spend their whole lives never getting to now. He was quiet for a moment, then, is that something you believe or something you're saying to make me feel better? Both, she said. They're not mutually exclusive. She paused. I believe it because I've seen it in myself. I spent years being somewhere else too. Not geographically, just somewhere else. And getting back to now, to actual now, is the hardest thing I've ever done. And I'm still doing it, every day. He looked at her. The summer evening was softening around them, the light going from hard gold to something amber and easier. We're a pair, he said. We are, she said. They stood on the porch for a while without speaking. Inside, Emma was audible, moving around the kitchen in that particular Emma way that managed to sound purposeful and haphazard simultaneously. Something set down, something opened, a comment made to herself about something. The evening came in. 7. Here is what nobody tells you about repair. It isn't a destination. People talk about it as if it is, as if the broken thing gets fixed, and then it's fixed, and you move on to the next thing. But what actually happens is more complicated and also more interesting. What actually happens is that you fix a thing, and then you live with the fixed thing, and the fixed thing reveals other things that need fixing, and you fix those, and that reveals others. The work doesn't end because the work is the living, and the living doesn't end. Caleb Mercer spent 6 years believing that the work of his grief was to get through it, to endure it, to come out the other side into some version of normal that waited for him if he could just hold on long enough. What he found instead was that the other side of grief isn't a restored version of what was there before. It's something different. It's a person who has carried something very heavy for a long time and has learned in the carrying things about their own capacity and their own limits that they could not have learned any other way. He'd failed his daughter for years. He knew this with the specific clarity that comes not from self-punishment but from genuine reckoning, the kind of accounting you do when you decide to stop the ledger in the past and start a new one in the present. He couldn't undo what he'd been absent for. He could only be present now. This was what Clara had said. This was what slowly he'd come to believe, not because she'd said it, but because he'd lived it long enough to feel it from the inside rather than just hear it from the outside. Emma was 10 in October. Caleb sat across from her at the birthday supper and watched his daughter eat her cake, badly frosted, because Clara and Emma had made it together, and Emma had gotten overconfident with the icing at a crucial stage, and thought about the version of himself that would have let this birthday pass like the others, quiet and minimally acknowledged, his grief so much larger than his awareness of what was happening in the room. That man still lived in him somewhere. He'd be a fool to think otherwise. Grief doesn't leave a person. It just gets layered over with things. With presence, with intention, with enough other experience that it stops being the loudest thing. He was still the man who'd lost Margaret. He was also now the man who sat at his daughter's birthday supper while his daughter argued with Clara about the structural integrity of the cake's second layer and took the time to actually see it. These things were simultaneously true. He'd made peace with the simultaneity. Clara watched Emma blow out the candles on a cake that was, structurally speaking, not entirely sound, and thought about the last time she'd sat at a birthday supper in a house that felt like hers and not just a place she was occupying. She'd stopped being able to remember, at some point in her years of moving from one position to the next, what it felt like to be inside a life rather than adjacent to one. She remembered the distinction now. It was this specific thing, a slightly lopsided cake and a 10-year-old with frosting on her chin, and a man across the table looking at his daughter like she was the most important thing he'd seen in years, which she was, which he now knew she was. The house was lit against the October dark. The garden outside was done for the year. The marigolds finished, the coneflowers turned to seed. Emma had collected the seeds herself, carefully, in paper envelopes she'd labeled in her large handwriting, planning already for the spring. She'd added the row she'd wanted, the memorial row she'd said was to mark when things changed, and the flowers had come up yellow-hearted and strong all summer and had been, in Claire's opinion, the best part of the garden this year. Emma had disagreed. Emma said the marigolds were the best part and would be every year. Clara had let her have this position because she suspected Emma was right. The ranch changed in the ways that places change when the people in them change. Not in its bones, which were what they'd always been, the flat land and the open sky and the seasons that did what the seasons did without reference to what the people under them wanted, but in the ways that living in a place changes it by degrees. The fence lines were maintained. The cattle were better managed than they'd been in years. because two people were thinking about the ranch's future rather than one person trying not to look at it. The garden produced enough in summer that Clara put by preserves and dried herbs and enough stored root vegetables to last through the worst of the winter. Emma had added by her own initiative 3 rows of kitchen herbs and a section of beans that she managed herself, and which produced with the enthusiasm of a thing that has been correctly placed in the world. In November, in a ceremony that was witnessed by Aldra Prentice and Nora Fitch, and Tom Rigby and the Hendersons from the North claims, Caleb Mercer and Clara Hale were married in the Harlow Creek Courthouse, which was not a church and was a room that mostly saw tax disputes and property filings, and was made briefly into something else by the presence of 2 people who had decided to make the thing they'd been living into the thing they said they were. Emma wore her best dress, which fit properly now because Clara had made it. She stood beside Clara and held the small bouquet Clara had assembled from the last dried coneflowers from the garden, pressed and wired, because Emma had decided that if there was going to be a ceremony, there should be something from the garden in it, and nobody had disagreed. It was not a long ceremony. It was not an elaborate one. The judge, a man named Callow, who had been in Harlow Creek for 30 years and had seen it through its various chapters, read the words. Caleb and Clara said the words, and then it was done. And Nora Fitch cried in the competent, contained way of a woman who has decided crying is permissible but should not exceed certain limits. And Aldra Prentice shook both their hands, and Tom Rigby said, "Well," again, which was once again his entire contribution. Emma looked up at Clara after it was over and said, very quietly, so that only Clara heard, "I was right, wasn't I? About Hale Mercer." "You have an annoying tendency to be right," Clara said. Emma's expression did the thing it did when she was trying not to show how pleased she was. "I know," she said. Tick. What they built was not a perfect thing. It was never going to be a perfect thing, and none of them wanted it to be, because perfection in a life is a kind of stasis, and stasis is just dying by another name. What they built was a working thing, a daily thing, a thing that required showing up every morning and doing the work of it, the actual work of the ranch, yes, but also the other work, the interior work of being present for people who need you to be present, of saying true things when true things need saying, of staying in the room when the room is difficult, of not disappearing into your own grief or your own fear or your own carefully maintained distance when someone on the other side of the table is reaching toward you and waiting to see if you'll reach back. Caleb reached back. It had taken him 6 years to do it, but he'd done it, and the doing of it had required him to be stripped down to something more honest than what he'd been walking around as, required a blizzard and a fever and a woman who walked into his house and told him the truth about his life, not with words, but simply by staying in it and doing what needed doing and not leaving when it would have been easier to leave. Clara had needed it too. She'd needed a place where she could stop being a person who managed herself into usefulness for other people and start being a person who was here, in her own right, with her own name on the ledger and her own garden and her own specific and non-negotiable presence. She'd found that here, which had not been what she came looking for. She'd come looking for a wage and a roof. She'd found a life. The difference between those two things was larger than any acreage she could measure. And Emma Mercer, who became Emma Mercer in something more than name the day Caleb began staying, who had been quiet and careful and too old for her age and had needed someone to sit on the floor outside her door and tell her the true thing without softening it. Emma had become, by 10 and 11 and on into the years beyond, a person who knew that she was worth being in the room for. This was the thing that mattered most. Not that she had a mother now, or that the town had decided to see her differently, or that the ranch was better than it had been. What mattered was that she knew, in the specific place where knowing lives, that she was worth showing up for, that the people in her life would stay. You could spend a lifetime trying to give a child every material thing they needed and fail to give them that one essential thing. You could also give them nothing but that one thing and discover that it was, by itself, enough to build on. Her father had learned to stay. Clara had learned to arrive. And Emma had learned, from watching both of them do the hardest work of their lives in the same house at the same time, that people are not fixed by nature. They are fixed by choice, repeatedly, on ordinary days, in small decisions that don't look like decisions at the time, but that accumulate into the shape of a life. The harsh country around them didn't soften. The winters came as they came. The summers burned and the wind moved over the flatlands in that long, unbroken way it always had, indifferent and enormous and entirely, permanently itself. But inside the fence lines of the Mercer Ranch, in the house with the blue curtains that had kept the sky inside since Margaret had chosen them, and that still moved in the afternoon air like something breathing, three people who had each been, in their own ways, lost, had been found, or had found each other, or had found the more accurate truth. That being found is not a thing that happens to you. It is a thing you do. You turn toward the light that's being offered. You stay in the room. You plant the marigolds even in a year you're not sure about, because the act of planting is itself the faith, not the certainty of the bloom. The flowers came back every spring. They always did.